a whole lot of Fed speak, and the people that we're hearing from,
they're
we've heard
out
from a
buying
couple
cowboy
times.
boots and cowboy hats.
Right, they are. They're busy. But the guy we need to hear from is going to be next week, and so it doesn't really matter what everybody else says until a week from Friday.
Seriously, right?
You said cowboy boots and cowboy hats.
Jackson Hole.
You have fly rod too that I know you take out there.
Yeah.
Some fly fishing as well
Yeah.
in Jackson Hole. Are you all packed? Are you ready?
I have not packed yet. I haven't picked out the color of the cowboy hat that I'm not allowed to wear on TV. So
Okay, but in all seriousness, it's not just the fun stuff. I saw you printing out some pretty thick economic policy papers yesterday.
That's the funny thing.
Some pre-reading.
Everybody is jealous that you get to go to Jackson Hole, and it's a beautiful place to be. Can't argue with that. And if I got 5 minutes, I might do a little fishing. But it's an academic conference with long 50 to 70 page academic papers that they get up and they present and discuss, and that's basically what it is. It isn't a bunch of central bankers sitting around going, what should we do next with the economy? It's theory.
Is there something, just one last question as we wrap up, something significant though about this Jackson Hole because of the timing and kind of where we are in terms of the narrative around what the Fed might do?
It's funny how that's worked out because Fed chairmen have in the past used this meeting to send significant messages. Started with Ben Bernanke in 2010 when he was talking about quantitative easing for the first time. And then other years, they just talk about the sort of the overall subject. But because of the way the timing has worked out with now pushed back to September, the possibility of a first rate move, then everybody's going to be focused on what Jay Powell has to say. Now, if he talks about the subject of the conference, that would really be funny. Well, no, nobody would laugh on Wall Street.
What is the subject of the conference?
Is that the transmission of monetary policy. Basically, it has the transmission mechanism changed since the pandemic.
All right, good stuff, as always. Michael McKee, thank you so much. Bloomberg News International Economics and Policy Correspondent Michael McKee. All right, that's our Eco Watch on this Tuesday. Tim, let's get to one stock that is definitely on our radar big time.
Yeah, that's Starbucks. The stock's soaring the most ever on an intraday basis as the company's board orders up a half-calf latte with the new CEO. And that CEO is one well known to the fast casual space and with riding a ship that's got some pretty big issues.
It's an individual that's really well known to us. It's Chipotle CEO Brian Niccol. We've talked to him a lot. Named to the top job at Starbucks, will take over as CEO on September 9th, replacing the existing CEO who was ousted after less than a year and a half at the helm. Through Monday, shares in the coffee chain had plunged 20% this year, following 2 straight quarters of comp sales decline. Shares of Starbucks, though, right now are up 22% today. So let's get into it with Bloomberg News consumer reporter Dina Shanker here in studio. And also with us is Bloomberg Intelligence senior credit analyst Jody Laurie in Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters out in Princeton, New Jersey. Dina, I want to start with you. To the news. What do we know? What does this mean for Starbucks? And what the Chipotle CEO, who will soon be the Starbucks CEO, Brian Niccol, brings to the table?
Well, one analyst called him a dream hire for CEO, I believe was the quote.
Interesting.
He really turned things around for Chipotle, and Chipotle is just outperforming the rest of the restaurant industry. So if you're sitting in a boardroom of a restaurant company and things aren't looking so good and you're like, who can save us? He would probably be at the very top of the list. So that was a great hire for them. And
he's someone who's also had to deal with a company that was under stress for many years, had to beef up their digital strategy, and came to the company, I'm thinking about Chipotle, just as the pandemic was hitting. And so he really had to learn how to kind of shift the ship, if you will, at Chipotle. And he's kind of got to do some of that here?
Yes, definitely. I mean, one thing that all of these restaurant companies deal with is productivity and how quickly can they turn an order into food and put that food into a customer's hands. And Chipotle has really improved on that. Starbucks really needs that kind of improvement. So I expect that that is going to be a big priority for him once he takes the job.
Hey, Jody, come on in here. And just because Brian Niccol was able to succeed so well at Taco Bell before going to Chipotle and then totally exceed expectations, I think, of a lot of investors of Chipotle as well, doesn't necessarily mean he can do the same thing at Starbucks. What are the challenges that he faces at Starbucks, given the environment over the last couple of years?
I think there's actually quite a few challenges that they're facing. I mean, first of all, they have a reputational risk, right? They've gotten hit by different headlines over and over. So first you had the union issues. Then you had the grassroots effort to sort of, rake Starbucks through the mud as it related to Middle Eastern conflict. And then you now have China, which was sort of their investment arm where they were kind of going to next. And so all these sort of components just ended up in not the best situation for them. So I think what they're really hoping is that he will provide that espresso shot that they're hoping for, that the prior CEO didn't quite get a chance to do over the past year and a half.
Jody, what does the Starbucks balance sheet look like?
Starbucks balance sheet, so taking a step back, the company, went through the pandemic, like all other companies, took on a bit of debt to have a little bit more cash going through the pandemic. And once the pandemic ended, they focused on deleveraging. They got leverage below 3 times, which was their target. But now the expectation, if you look at MODL on the terminal, the expectation is that it'll hit to 3.4, 3.5 times by the end of the fiscal year, which is September. So definitely a reversion from where they were in terms of improving the balance sheet. That said, it's not a company that we're necessarily worried about at the moment being a BBB company, but it could be an issue as activists get involved and as management sort of gets creative in how they turn the company around.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the company gets turned around, Dina, and think about this from the perspective of, a company that I think for a lot of people over the last 30-ish years reinvented the way that coffee was consumed and delivered here in the U.S. At Taco Bell, Doritos Locos Taco, at Chipotle, did a lot, as Carol mentioned, with digital. Starbucks already has a robust digital platform, and it has for years. There's the China element, too, and the weakness that they've seen in China. What are the challenges that he has to overcome to turn Starbucks around?
So one thing that I think is particular to Starbucks that he has to think about is that one of the ways Starbucks really differentiated itself out of the gate was they were going to be committed to high quality coffee when they started to branch out into lots of other things like music and movies and teddy bears in the restaurants. Howard Schultz came back and said, we're a coffee company. We're going to focus on coffee. We've now seen them once again branching out into lots of other things. They have lemonade refreshers. They have energy drinks. But a lot of people like those. So I am really curious to see how new management what direction they want to go in. Do they want to go back to basics, what worked once, or do they want to see what's working now and then maybe cut the fat? I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see.
New management, but yet they've got someone who has been associated with the company for a long time, and I'm thinking about Howard Schultz. He's not on the board, doesn't have a board seat, doesn't have a formal role with the company, but he's Starbucks' 6th largest shareholder, and obviously, this is his company. And for better or for worse, perhaps, his involvement, is that a good thing for him to still, in terms of understanding this company, or is this a case where you have to have an outsider who understands, Dina, the fast casual space, kind of do his thing? Bring some new blood.
I think the real question is whether a new CEO wants to stand up to Howard, because just as an outside observer, it seems like Howard really likes to share his opinions on the company.
And come back to the company.
And come back and return,
right?
over and over again. And so, they hired someone really strong. So hopefully Howard will take a hint and keep some opinions to himself, or at least give them a chance to run with some things.
And apparently Howard Schultz had told Melody Hobson, who's on the Starbucks board, that I guess she had told him about a week ago about her decision for Brian Niccol, and that Schultz apparently said, Melody, that's a home run. So he seems to like it. Jody, how do you think about this company? Obviously, you focus on the balance sheet, understanding the finances and kind of what needs to be done there, but it all goes back to management and how they manage, and that will ultimately play out in the balance sheet. How do you think about the leadership of Brian Niccol, maybe what he did at Chipotle and what he can maybe do here or has to do here?
So I think we have to take a step back and think about when he was actually at Yum, right? He was the Taco Bell CEO. So granted, he was not the Yum CEO. He was not at the helm. However, he did ride through the spin-off of Yum China. And I can't say that that's necessarily the direction that Starbucks is going. I mean, we didn't see that at Chipotle, but it is something that sort of lurks in the back of my mind of, okay, what's management going to do? And if you remember what happened with Yum, not only did they spin off Yum China, but they took that cash and gave it to shareholders. Now, Starbucks before this, going into this, had a 3-year plan of giving back to shareholders $20 billion. And they had the cash flow for it to some extent, but you also thought, okay, some of it might be financed with debt. And so I think my question is do they pull back on that and go full on CapEx? Do they get creative with how they sort of deal with licensed versus owned stores, you know, their international business versus their domestic? I mean, I think there's a lot of different avenues that he can look at. Never mind, of course, you know, the transition into things like Doritos Locos breakfast sandwiches. I don't know.
I was thinking the Doritos Locos latte. It doesn't really have
latte,
the same ring
Doritos
to
Locos
it, right?
latte.
Yeah, I'll pass. I'll pass. I'll take the coffee upstairs. All right, guys, we got to run. Thank you so much. Bloomberg News consumer reporter Dina Schenker and Bloomberg Intelligence senior credit analyst Jody Laurie. Shares of Starbucks hovering near their best levels of the session, up almost 22%. On the flip side, you've got Chipotle, Mexican Grill, off its lows, but Tim still down about 7%.
Yeah, it was down as much as 14%. Scott Boatwright, the COO, was named Chipotle's interim CEO. So we'll follow that company and let you know any developments there when it comes to their executive suite.
On our radar, two of the world's most recognizable names, Elon and Donald, in conversation. That's next.
2:21 on Wall Street, I'm Amy Morris. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic says he is looking for a little more data before supporting a reduction in interest rates, emphasizing that he wants to be sure the U.S. Central Bank will not have to change course once it starts cutting. Bostic reiterated the stance that he's held since March, that he will likely be ready to cut by the end of the year. Stocks are higher after the latest U.S. inflation data reinforced speculation that the Fed may be able to cut rates as soon as September. And we check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 78 points, NASDAQ up 363, Dow up 339 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 3.85%. The 2-year yield at 3.94%. We're watching NYMEX crude oil now down almost 2% or $1.58, trading at $78.48 a barrel. COMEX gold is up 0.1% or $3.40, now at $25.07 per ounce. Paramount Global began laying off staff this morning after the entertainment industry, or rather the company, said last week it planned to slash 15% of its U.S.-based workforce. That's about 2,000 positions. The iconic Paramount Television Studios is shutting down this week as part of the cost-cutting efforts. Shares of Paramount Global are little changed. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol and Tim.
Much appreciated, Amy Morris there in D.C. All right, well, the long and winding road, that was last night's conversation between two individuals who use social media like no other, you might say. And for one, Donald Trump, it was a return to the platform X for the first time in almost a year. For the other, well, it's his platform. Elon Musk, of course, owns it. And bottom line, the two together on X are very interesting bedfellows that made for an interesting conversation. How many times can we say interesting? And one that got off to a late start.
We unfortunately had a massive distributed denial of service attack against our servers. As this massive attack illustrates, there's a lot of opposition to people just hearing what President Trump has to say.
All right, that, of course, was Elon Musk last night as he began his conversation with former President Donald Trump last night. Tim O'Brien writes about it for Bloomberg Opinion in a column on the Bloomberg that you can find also at Bloomberg.com/opinion. Tim is a senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. His books include Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. He joins us in studio, and we are so grateful. Thank you, thank you. Like you, we all tuned in. I thought I missed it, but luckily it ran late. I mean, this was I keep saying an interesting conversation, but it really was. And it was a long and winding road.
And revealing. I sat there and was about to check out, and I just happened to have the spaces open.
Yeah.
And I was in my home office, and Elon's voice suddenly flooded my home office, saying, "Here we go." 42 minutes after the hour. They were supposed to start at 8. It was 8:42. He has said, as you noted in that clip, that there was a denial of service attack that hasn't been substantiated. Others in the press, it actually didn't happen. Be that as it may, it was sort of before they got into the serious meat of the evening. It was humorous to me that two of the can-do entrepreneurs of the planet couldn't get a digital meeting started on time. But we've got more important fish to fry than that moment, which is I think they launched into a very conspiratorial, fact-free discussion about how the world works across a variety of themes, whether it was immigration, foreign policy,
all important
climate
ones.
change.
Yeah.
Very meaty things, but a lot of it not tethered to reality, particularly when they discussed, I think Elon Musk thought they were going to have a discussion about the virtues of nuclear energy, and Donald Trump made it into sort of a discussion of the virtues of nuclear weapons.
Right.
So it was all over the map.
Did you learn anything new about Donald Trump's platform or how he plans to run against Kamala Harris in that conversation last night?
Well, I think the thing that has come up is he came in, into the Republican National Convention. I was there in Milwaukee with an enormous amount of momentum behind him. And there was this idea that he was going to depart from the Trump of yore, and he wasn't going to be divisive, and he was going to have a unity message. And by the time he took the stage in Milwaukee, he began with an account of the assassination attempt. He was hitting some of the right notes. That speech quickly devolved into American carnage, and which is themes he's been hitting his entire political career. And I think his supporters and strategists within the GOP have hoped since that event that he would find reset moments to sort of reestablish the public dialogue, to talk about policy, talk about cohesion rather than division, opportunity rather than carnage, et cetera. And it's just gotten worse and worse. And I would suggest there's probably a couple of reasons behind that. One is Donald Trump, when he gets cornered, tends to lash out. It's just his instinctive nature in his personal life, in his business life, politically. And I think the ascent of Kamala Harris has taken him and his campaign by surprise, and they haven't figured out how to respond to it. So there's sort of political desperation here. Secondly, I just don't think he has a lot of toolkits to reach into from a policy perspective or from a narrative perspective. He hits a certain number of notes and can't really move beyond them. And when he's set free by an interlocutor like Musk, who doesn't really want to stop him from rambling, and shares some of the kind of unhinged perspectives, you get what we had last night, which was a kind of frat boy meltdown.
Well, I kept thinking about, I was listening, because I thought Elon Musk was like, this was an opportunity to see maybe a different side of Donald Trump. And I thought, if it was really structured from all of us who are broadcasters or journalists, like we go into an interview, right? There's a plan, there's a strategy, you want to cover certain things. I thought, God, this would have been an ideal opportunity to actually go through in a logical way. And then it just came undone.
And he sort of said that at the top. We can, that this isn't a hostile environment.
Yeah.
I'm not a gotcha journalist.
Right.
But the really trick, I think, to think about great interviews is that you're not serving yourself as the interviewer. You're trying to be fair to the subject. You're also ultimately serving the audience and trying to be their tour guide through an educational moment. And this was really just almost like a couple of guys at a bar yucking it up and unconcerned with the audience. I mean, it went on for 2 hours.
Yeah.
It didn't have a linear progression. It was loaded with bonkers moments. And in truth, he actually did reveal the real Trump he said he wanted to, which is someone who's like Don from Queens sitting at home, bleating angrily into the radio.
Can I ask you, why do you think, or what was the purpose of this as an exercise from the Trump campaign perspective?
Well, I think they're trying to reintroduce vibrancy, surprise, and cohesion to a campaign that's really back on its heels. And I think, Trump's presser at Mar-a-Lago last week, which also went off the rails, was another effort to do this. Mm-hmm. He didn't reset then. He didn't reset last night. I imagine his handlers are pulling their hair out because Donald Trump is unmanageable and no one can really tell him how to campaign.
I do wonder about who they're reaching with these interviews that he's been doing outside of the quote-unquote mainstream media. Because if you think back to 2016 when he beat Hillary Clinton, surprised a lot of folks, it was essentially decided by fewer than 100,000 votes across 3 different swing states. He needs to reach just a few thousand people in a handful of swing states in order to win, at least according to polls right now. Is there any indication that those are the type of folks who are listening to a Twitter Spaces or listening to a gaming streamer interview?
No, I don't think so. And that's such a good question, Tim. And that's not just a challenge for Donald Trump. That's also a challenge for Kamala Harris, because it's 7 swing states that are going to decide this election. And it's, I think, sort of moderate to independent voters in those states. And Harris has a different set of challenges to reach them than Trump does. But I think I think both Biden and Trump had turned off those voters, and they weren't sure what they wanted to hear. I think Harris has gotten some traction around that. But, with her issue is she's really motivated her base, and so she's got a deeper level of support in already blue states. She hasn't broadened her support necessarily. We haven't seen that yet, though polling suggests she has, to the swing states. And Trump in the same way, he's got this deep MAGA support, but he's never held much appeal to moderate Republicans or independent voters who want rational public policy and a constructive view of the world.
I know they're both supposed to debate each other, but I don't know that we're going to get a lot on policy potentially in a debate. Don't they both owe it to the American public to really sit down and do a clear interview that really gets into policies that we can really understand what they both stand for?
Of course they do, Carol, and I want you to run for office one day. I think some of it is just what's been proven on the campaign trail is that the further you stay away from precise policy positions and pluck at people's emotional heartstrings, you can have a very effective candidacy that's emotionally driven and not get pinned down on the specifics of different policy points. This also happens with court justices when they're trying out for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But I do think in an ideal world, every politician should be able to lay out a very clear roadmap for what they want to give to the American people. So yes, I think they should. In practice, I think we've learned in the media, the social media era we're in, that vibes sometimes can be more powerful than policy.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about the X platform and Trump's return to it. One of my decliners yesterday was Truth Social, DJT. Part of it was the reported numbers, but also part of it was that Trump had gone back to Twitter after.
Right.
He has a Twitter competitor that he still posts a lot too. As Carol and I were talking about earlier, President Biden announced that he was not running for re-election on the X platform via letter. Is this a moment for Elon Musk's platform?
It's a moment that may only last about 2 months or 2.5 months. It's undoubtedly, Threads hasn't taken off. Some of the alternative platforms that could have taken advantage from the mismanagement of Twitter, and it's kind of unraveling to a certain extent, didn't step up. Twitter's still a very vibrant space for non-normies. People like you and me, like journalists are on there, policy
Still
pros.
on there, right?
But average Americans aren't, on Twitter, 24/7 figuring out how to understand the world.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you, and I don't know that we've got it up for the viewers, but back in July of 2022, Truth Social, a post by President Trump, when Elon Musk came to the White House asking me for help on all of his many subsidized projects, whether it's electric cars that don't drive long enough, driverless cars that crash, or rocket ships to nowhere, without which subsidies he'd be worthless, and telling me how he was a big Trump fan and Republican, I could have said, drop to your knees and beg, and he would have done it. This is Donald Trump back in July of 2022. Tim, do they like each other? What is this relationship?
So the first things first, Donald Trump has said this about every major CEO in the country. He used to tell me these stories about Jack Welch. He would say, one time Jack Welch called me and he was crying. I just doubt that ever happened. So you've always got to be skeptical of his accounts of meetings with anyone else. Particularly if they're more talented or successful than he is. I think they both, to a certain extent, need each other.
Interesting.
Elon Musk occupies a portion of the business landscape that is very similar to the portion of the political landscape that Donald Trump occupies. Tesla was born out of government subsidies. SpaceX was born out of a relationship with NASA. Elon Musk also took a lot of daring risks to make those things happen. He brought a lot of managerial aptitude to it.
Yeah.
He's not a good media manager, and he is as politically, I think, unhinged and unaware as Donald Trump is when it comes to other subjects. So in that way, he's very different from Trump as a tactical business person, but very similar about someone who wants to surf on emotions.
10 seconds. Is it helpful for Trump to have Elon in his corner?
I don't know that it matters at this point, honestly.
Okay.
Elon's not going to get him to the voters he needs.
Great stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Always, always. Tim O'Brien, Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion. You can read Tim's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion. It's on the Bloomberg terminal, also at bloomberg.com/opinion.
And still to come after a quick break, the Great Nantucket experiment gets an F-, so say some, in a new story out on Bloomberg. We're going to have that story and more when we return. Meantime, a check of the markets. We see green across the screen. The Dow up 0.9%, the S&P up 1.5%, the Nasdaq up 2.2%.
This is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. U.S. wholesale inflation cooled in July, another sign that price pressures are continuing to ease. The Labor Department reported its producer price index rose 0.1% from June to July and 2.2% from a year before. That has traders watching for the Fed's response and whether a rate cut could come as soon as September. And we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 82 points, NASDAQ up 382 points, and the Dow up 375 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 3.85, then the 2-year yield at 3.94. NYMEX crude oil is now down 2%, or $1.60, trading at $78.46 a barrel. COMEX gold is up 0.1%, or $2.50, trading at $25.06 per ounce. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic says he's looking for more data before supporting a reduction in interest rates, emphasizing that he wants to be sure the central bank will not have to change course once it starts to cut. Bostic reiterated his stance that he's held since March, that he'll likely be ready to cut by the end of the year. And Starbucks has named a new CEO and chairman. The company has appointed Chipotle CEO Brian Niccol as its next leader effective September 9th. The leadership shakeup comes after activist investors Elliott Investment Management and Starboard Value reportedly amassed stakes in the company. Shares of Starbucks now 22% higher. Shares of Chipotle now down 7.8%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovic.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Well, in Nantucket, there's a growing sense that the roughly 50-square-mile island has become a casualty in the push for cleaner energy. So any accident, however minor it might be, involving the nearby farm was bound to become a flashpoint in the broader fight over wind.
And that's exactly what has happened. Here to talk more about the Nantucket rage over a broken wind turbine blade is Bloomberg News energy and climate disasters reporter Josh Saul. He's here in our studio. Before we get too far into this, remind everyone what happened a few weeks ago on Nantucket with this accident.
Will do. And I just want to mention to everyone who can't see me, I did wear my Nantuckiest sweater.
I was going to say.
Here today. It's pretty good, right?
It is pretty good. It was in my desk. No Nantucket red pants, though.
That's true.
Do you have docksiders
That would be a
on?
whole other step. Nope, just the Solomons, just the dad shoes.
Okay.
So exactly 1 month ago, one of the blades on the Vineyard Wind Farm, so this is a big wind farm. It'll eventually be 62 wind turbines, each as big as the Eiffel Tower with the Statue of Liberty on top of them. One single blade fell apart and fell into the water, and pieces of that were floating in the water. Pieces of it eventually washed ashore on Nantucket and created a real uproar on the island.
What happened though? Beaches closed? What kind of?
Beaches closed for a very short amount of time.
Okay.
People on the island were very angry. They likened it to an oil spill. It was almost like Jaws approaching the beach, like just a really big deal. The federal government shut down both construction and electricity generation at the Vineyard Wind Farm, which is still ongoing.
Okay, you're from Alaska. I'm from California. We've experienced oil spills in our day, geographically. Was this environmentally on the same level as an oil spill?
So far, it seems to be a lot smaller impact. It definitely freaked people out, but we don't have any reports of dead animals. They're, in comparison, solid chunks of fiberglass are a lot easier to clean up compared to oil in terms of the way it spreads, the way it sinks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seems like a much more small scale failure compared to an actual oil spill.
Couple of questions. I mean, how often are there accidents with wind farms? I'm just curious about the frequency of it. And also, how important, though, are these wind farms to power on the island, in the region? How important are they?
Yeah, so wind backers, the clean energy advocates, view these as extremely important because what they're going to be doing is they're going to be sending clean energy, so carbon-free energy, to the shore, kind of at exactly the times, like windy periods of the day, when the grid really needs it. So you can have solar on land producing a lot of energy, obviously in the middle of the day when the sun is up, but wind offshore can be sending energy in, in the morning, in the evening, and at night when that solar power isn't available. So it's seen as a really important part of the transition.
Josh, is it powered just to the island? Is it to other areas? I'm just curious how far this stuff goes.
Actually, the undersea cable will bypass Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, kind of running right between them to the mainland, powering the equivalent, according to the companies, of about 400,000 homes. I mean, these things can produce huge amounts of energy. So instead of the natural gas plants or other fossil climate changing types of generation on land, we would have the offshore wind, these clean electrons flowing there.
A big part of your story that you wrote along with Cam and the team at Bloomberg News has to do with the implications of an accident like this on other wind farm projects throughout the United States that are planned for the future. Talk a little bit about what's being planned right now, some community pushback to these, and what it could mean to have an accident like this.
That's exactly right, because under Biden, who set a very aggressive offshore wind target of 30 gigawatts by 2030, there are a lot of other, about a total of 8 projects in development, something like 13 gigawatts, coming on, and you can imagine, a gigawatt is about how much a nuclear reactor produces. So it's a lot of clean energy coming on. But Vineyard Wind was really seen, or is really seen, as kind of the marquee, like kind of the first big project. There's been some very small pilot projects. There's a smaller wind farm off of Long Island built by other developers, but this was seen as kind of the first like utility scale. Like it produces as much power as a big gas plant. And the worry is that even these kind of relatively small hiccups like this produce so much anger, produce so much pushback against this new energy source that, especially with a Trump election, he could, as he said, come in on day one and kind of drastically change the landscape for these big projects.
I was thinking about that, how the outcome of the November presidential election, whoever is in the White House, that might determine the future path when it comes to wind energy, wind farms in the future, the growth of this industry. Or has the kind of horse left the stable already?
The way we think about it, projects that are already permitted and in construction would be a pretty big deal for anyone, even a president, to sort of tear out of the seabed. But projects that are still have any kind of permits left to get, not particularly hard for a federal agency to drastically slow down or even stop that process. Trump said at a big rally in New Jersey, like, I would stop all this on day one. The worry with this is that, the worry with incidents like this is that it just kind of makes it, more at the forefront, more top in his, in his mind or in his administration's mind. And just as Biden used presidential powers once he got to office to slow down or stop offshore gas and oil drilling, Trump could conceivably do the same thing with offshore wind.
One thing that I was thinking about in reading your piece, Josh, is that there's kind of no free lunch or no silver bullet when it comes to solving the energy needs in a renewable way here in the U.S. and around the world. It seems like there has to be, with every project, some sort of give and take with a community or with a location.
I think that's exactly right. No free lunch, no free energy. Like, there's trade-offs with all these projects. Like, you build, even what we think of as, a big solar farm in the middle of the desert. That's great. People who live nearby in Arizona are mad about, all the desert tortoises being killed by the construction. And they're also like, hey, we like to ride our horses around here. It's more fun to ride your horses when it's not a solar farm. Like, basically anywhere you want to build energy, there are these trade-offs. And that's, one of the conservationists we spoke to on Nantucket, who said, by the way, like, yeah, this has completely turned the tide, but like completely changed how the island feels about it. Like, the island is pretty united against offshore wind, at least right now. And he said, there's trade-offs in any, and there's benefits and costs with any energy source.
Where does this leave Vineyard Wind, right? This is the company behind the wind farms. And I also do think about, like, oversight, where you don't want these things to fall apart. You want them to work. Just like if you build a nuclear power plant, you don't want a meltdown. Like, you've got to make sure that there's oversight. Is there enough oversight, or is it a company issue? What was it? And we just got about 30 seconds here.
Vineyard Wind and then the turbine maker, GE Vernova, have been very active about both cleaning up debris and also checking turbines to make sure this doesn't happen again. This could change some oversight or the amount of money that companies have to put forward.
All right, something we're going to keep a watch on. Really good stuff. And the sweater, totally in on it.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Josh Saul, he is energy and climate disasters reporter here at Bloomberg News, joining us here in studio on a day where you've got stocks pretty much holding on to their best levels of the session. It means up about 1.5% on the S&P 500. NASDAQ 100 outperforming up 2.3%. So we'll continue to count you down over the next kind of hour and 10 minutes. Coming up, we're looking at the market for jobs for recent grads, the difference between men and women. That's next.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg in Washington, I'm Amy Morris. Starbucks has named a new CEO and chairman. The company has appointed Chipotle CEO Brian Niccol as its next leader effective September 9th. The leadership shakeup comes after activist investors Elliott Investment Management and Starboard Value reportedly amassed stakes in the company. Elliott Investment Management released a statement saying it views today's leadership announcement as a transformational step forward for Starbucks. Shares of Starbucks now 22% higher. Shares of Chipotle are 7.3% lower. High interest rates and inflation have consumers holding off buying homes or pursuing renovations that would typically need financing, and Home Depot is starting to feel that. The retailer lowered its forecast of a key sales metric for the year on expectations that consumers will continue to hold back spending in the coming months. The retailer says it now sees comparable sales falling 3 to 4% for the year, below the average analyst estimate compiled by Bloomberg. The company also expects adjusted earnings per share to be 1 to 3% lower for the year. Alphabet's Google is rolling out upgraded smartphones, watches, and earbuds. Google is aiming to take on Apple and Samsung and offer more ways to use artificial intelligence. The hardware also has some outward changes, with Google moving away from that curved design it's used for several years on its Pixel phones. Paramount Global began laying off staff this morning after the entertainment company said last week it planned to slash 15% of its U.S.-based workforce, about 2,000 positions. The iconic Paramount Television Studios is shutting down this week as part of the cost-cutting efforts. Shares of Paramount Global are little changed on the news. And those are the company stories that we are following for you throughout this hour. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody. Carol Master along with Tim Stenivek live here on Bloomberg Business Week on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Original. So reading in, one of the stories that definitely popped up on our radar has to do with recent grads. And what we're finding out, Bloomberg News Analysis, we looked into government data and found that young men are holding out for the right positions while women are being more flexible. And so we're seeing a bit of a gender divide among recent college graduates.
Yeah, so young college-educated women are sticking with their job search even as the number of vacancies shrink. Many of their male peers are choosing to take a break. The share of male college grads who are participating in the workforce has declined in the past year, with 1 in 5 under the age of 25 neither employed nor actively looking for work. This is according to the latest 12-month average in a Bloomberg News analysis of government data.
All right, you do the dudes, I'll do the women. The contrast with data for female graduates, which show their participation rate holding broadly steady over the past few years. One big reason is that they're more likely than men to turn to part-time work or take jobs that they're overqualified for to support themselves. They have slightly lower rates of underemployment than their male colleagues, a Burning Glass Institute report found, possibly because, Tim, they're finding some creative ways to kickstart their careers.
So if you're thinking about the job market that recent college grads are now confronting, it's kind of shifting into a lower gear after a 3-year run of historically strong hiring, kind of mirroring what's happening when it comes to the broader labor market as well. The unemployment rate ticked up for a 4th month in July. The ratio of openings to job seekers was at 1.2 in June, down from a peak of 2 to 1 back 2 years ago. So for entry-level positions in particular, the number of postings currently lags behind the levels seen 2 years before. That's according to Rebelio Labs. It's a firm that collects and analyzes workforce data.
What's interesting, too, is some things that are going on in the job market.
Yeah.
What this says is college-educated men, they've historically had the upper hand in the job market, now finding themselves at a bit of a disadvantage. What they're saying, this reporting is showing in the study, male-dominated industries, so that includes things like technology, it also includes finance. They have been at the forefront of the recent slowdown, eliminating positions and halting expansion plans as those industries cope with overhiring. A lot of that overhiring happening post-pandemic, right? Really amping up their labor forces. Also, higher borrowing costs and an uncertain economic outlook. So you're seeing both tech and finance maybe not do as much hiring going forward.
So young men are more likely to bide their time until they land a position with the kind of pay they expect, even if it means taking time off from their job search. This is according to Harry Holzer, who's a professor of public policy at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. While the labor market is showing signs of softening, they may prefer to wait until they have the upper hand again, where the professor says, quote, whereas maybe young women feel more pressure to make good use of this time.
Yeah, I think what's another interesting aspect of the story, something that I think we all kidded about, joked about, and it was actually a serious thing that a lot of times, you know, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of younger individuals maybe staying with their parents, living with their parents. It was a really rough economy. And this story goes into one reason some recent college grads can afford to take their time finding the right job, whether you're male or female, is because more are living with the family. According to the Census Bureau, 73.2% of adult men under 25 were living with relatives last year. The comparable figure for women was 68%. And if you back out the pandemic years, that's a record high for both genders in data going back almost 6 decades. Not to mention, it's expensive for younger folks. And some of them are saying, Mom, Dad, can I live with you for a little while?
So real implications for what happens to the labor market. Real implications for potentially what happens demographically as young people stay at home longer and don't find full-time work.
Yeah, and maybe not as much money to spend, so that has an economic implication perhaps as well. All right, that's going to do it for this hour of Bloomberg Business Week. For those watching on TV, the close is coming up. Tim and I are continuing on Bloomberg Business Week over the next couple of hours.
Yeah, we got geopolitics on our mind. We're also going to be joined by the CEO of the coal company Ramaco Resources. All that and more next on Bloomberg Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we got 60 minutes away from the closing bell on this Tuesday, August 13th, and we've got a rally underway.
Stocks.
In stocks. Bonds are up too. Yields have backed off as well. An inflation print that says maybe we're easing. Go ahead, Fed. Cut rates come September.
Okay, maybe that's going to happen.
Maybe.
Maybe. We'll see. We got more economic data coming later
Markets
this week.
seem to think that it's going to happen.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at the NASDAQ up 2.3%, the S&P 500 up 1.5%.
Yeah.
Kind of a far cry from what we saw last week.
What a difference, right?
Yeah.
What a difference, how many, 5-6 days make?
I can't count. I can't count that high.
Having said that, we continue to follow geopolitics. We're going to dig into that in a couple different ways this coming hour. One is Ukraine. Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist Mark Champion on if you want peace for Ukraine, let it strike in Russia. It is an opinion piece, but we'll see what he has to say about that.
We're also going to be joined by Bloomberg News senior wealth reporter Heather Perlberg, talking about the Middle East trillions forcing new concessions from Wall Street.
Not really the war, but it's just interesting to watch what's going on in terms of the amount of money that continues to be centered in the Middle East and what it's doing and what Wall Street is doing to get kind of a piece of it. Also, we're going to talk with the CEO of Ramaco Resources on earnings and AI's impact on the coal industry. This will be fascinating. It's not necessarily the coal you always think of.
Thermal coal
Right.
versus metallurgical coal.
You're going to learn something,
Yeah,
everybody.
you're going to learn something
'Cause we
about
did.
coal. We certainly did. Also, we got the a correspondent for the New York Times. She's got a brand new book out, Billionaire Nerd, Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World.
Can't wait.
She's going to be joining us a little later in the hour.
First up, let's check in with Amy Morris. She is in for Charlie Pelt with a check on the trading day. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Carol. Starbucks shares are 22% higher. Chipotle shares are down 7.2% after the coffee chain named Chipotle's Brian Niccol as chairman and CEO effective September 9th. He'll replace Laxman Narzaman, who is stepping down effective immediately. Jody Lurie is a credit analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Who knows what's on the table? All we know is that there might be a potential additional board member from Elliott Management. There might be all sorts of changes from that stable sort of cash-generating Starbucks that we know.
Jody Lurie with Bloomberg Intelligence. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. Download that wherever you get your podcasts. Morgan Stanley's chief U.S. equity strategist Mike Wilson says it is wise to be defensive amid stagnant markets because of slowing growth and weak consumer trends.
Growth is slowing, okay? Earnings expectations probably are still too high for the second half of this year. And a Fed that's reluctant to be proactive, okay? And I don't disagree. People are criticizing the Fed. I'm like, well, look, they're just being data dependent. I mean, and so they're doing their job. They're going to react if they need to. If they overreact, then that probably exacerbates the carry trade problem.
Mike Wilson on Bloomberg Television. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 85 points. NASDAQ up 390 points. The Dow up 397 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 3.85% and the 2-year yield at 3.94%. And that is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that. We certainly do appreciate it. Well, as we await the rest of this week's economic reports, another thing on our minds of investors continues to be geopolitics. And on that, Carol, President Vladimir Putin has called in a trusted aide and former personal bodyguard to be his eyes and ears in monitoring operations to expel Ukrainian forces from Russia. This according to two people familiar with the decision.
And Tim, it was just about 1 week ago that Ukraine counterstriked into Russia's Kursk region. There are many questions about the strike and the strategy. Writing about it, what it may mean for peace for Ukraine. With us is Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist. He is Mark Champion. He joins us once again from London. Check out Mark's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion. You can find it on the Bloomberg terminal, also at bloomberg.com/opinion. Hey, Mark, thanks for staying up late for us. We really appreciate it. What do we know about this counterstrike?
Yeah, I mean, we know a few things. One is that, in a war where everybody it's said that, the most difficult thing to do, most important thing to do in a war, to exercise surprise over your enemy has become almost impossible to do because just of the sort of plethora of drones that are, showing everything, every movement on the ground. The Ukrainians managed to surprise the Russians and put them into a real state of disarray. So, we know that happened. We know that they now hold a swathe of territory. Estimates of exactly how big it is vary, and we're not sure how much they are kind of digging in and holding, and how much they're just sort of floating over at the moment and have no intention to hold even temporarily. But we're talking about somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilometers square of Russian territory. Russia has had to, evacuate lots of people. It's been a kind of messy response. They've been reluctant to take hardened troops, off the front lines in Ukraine, because that's exactly what the Ukrainians would like them to do. So they are responding to this with a kind of really sort of motley crew of different types of forces. And as you mentioned just now, it's pretty clear that Putin isn't happy that they were caught napping in this way, and he's bringing in some new blood to try and sort of fix the situation and bring all these kind of disparate forces together and reassert control.
I mean, Mark, 2.5 years into this war, a war that a lot of observers who we spoke to 2.5 years ago on our air said this would be over in a couple of weeks and it would end with the defeat of Ukraine. How, in your view, does this end?
Really, the million-dollar question, a very difficult one to answer. I think, there are a number of goals that the Ukrainians may have simultaneously with this operation. But for sure, because they've kind of mentioned it several times and it makes, a lot of sense, and it fits in with a wider strategy of long-range strikes within Russia, partly what they're trying to do here is to make it clear to Putin in particular that, so long as this war continues, Russia will be unsafe. That these kinds of incursions will happen, that they will continue, just like the long-range strikes against oil refineries, against ships in the Black Sea Fleet, airfields. Russia simply cannot be immune from these kinds of attacks, and the hope is that as a result, once the Russians decide that they can't actually make much more ground in Ukraine, they will sit down and negotiate. And if Ukraine is able to hold on to some of this territory, even a small sliver of territory in the Kursk region, that will give them something to bargain with that that they wouldn't otherwise have and would desperately need.
Mark, where are Ukraine's allies on all of this? What are we hearing from the Western leaders?
Well, they're relatively quiet and supportive. If you think back to as you were mentioning, 2.5 years ago when the war started, the allies, in particular countries like Germany, were extremely reluctant to give anything to the Ukrainians that the Russians might see as provocative. They were worried about an escalation to nuclear escalation, and here we have Western weapons, including U.S.-made Bradleys, being used not only on the battlefield in Ukraine, but in Russia, which for a long time was a taboo. So, partly, again, one of the goals of the Ukrainians will be to show, again, that these kinds of red lines can be crossed without some, main nuclear escalation on the part of Putin, and that the threats, that he makes and his government makes fairly regularly are empty. If you can do that, then the remaining restrictions that the U.S. in particular has on using weapons like ATACMS, these are surface-to-surface missiles that have a range of around up to 300 kilometers, that it's 190 miles, those restrictions will be lifted, and the Ukrainians will have more tools to conduct these kinds of strikes. And the logic on the Ukrainian side is, if you want this war to end, help us to inflict this kind of damage, because that is the only thing that will actually force Putin to the table in a meaningful way.
How should the West, or how should the entire world, think about nuclear weapons use? We got a question from one of the members of our audience asking about whether or not Putin would use nukes. Is that something that observers are thinking is still a possibility?
I mean, no, you can never take it off the table. Russia is a major nuclear power. But, 2.5 years into this war, 2.5 years of threats, 2.5 years of red lines crossed, nothing happening in terms of nuclear. I think we have to conclude that Putin understands that he has a lot more to lose than to gain by using even tactical nuclear weapons. It's very difficult. The most conceivable, in my view, action that he might take on the nuclear side would be to create an accident in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is in Ukraine, and which the Russian forces hold. And if my view, when there was a fire in that plant a couple of days ago, and the Ukrainians said it was a Ukrainian drone strike, that was another warning. The fire was set by the Russians themselves. It was harmless, but they're trying to use this as leverage in order to influence Ukraine's allies. My own view, as I say, is that we know now that the Russians understand that they have more to lose than to gain. And if you think about what would happen if there were an accident in Zaporizhzhia at that plant, it's as likely that the wind blows and hurts Russian forces and Russian citizens as it is that it blows the other way. My view is that the risk is much lower than many people believe.
Mark, it's hard, just to kind of wrap up, it's hard not to feel like that this is kind of either a new chapter in the war between the two. And is it, I hate to say game changer, but does it kind of potentially change the outcome, maybe in Ukraine's favor?
I think, no, it's not a game changer. And it's simply a contributor to a policy that they are already pursuing. It won't on its own win the war, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ends fairly quickly, this incursion. I think we can see a building policy.
All right, going to leave it there. Listen, thanks again. Really glad. We were hoping to touch upon this today, so glad you could join us. Of course, that's Mark Champion, international affairs columnist at our Bloomberg Opinion team, joining us there, Tim, from London.
Well, as we continue to look around the globe, we come to a story that is the most read on the Bloomberg that also happens to be today's Bloomberg Big Take. Wall Street is the financial capital of the world, and getting it to do things well, you usually need to have buy-in from the folks who believe it is the thing to do.
Enter the Middle East, and it's trillions of dollars to invest, and you will find that within the moneyed circles of the Middle East, there's increasing talk of a shifting power dynamic in the upper echelons of higher finance. So writes Heather Perlberg and some of her colleagues. Let's get more on the shift of power. Let's go to Bloomberg News senior wealth reporter Heather Perlberg. She joins us from Washington, D.C. By the way, you can read her story and more from the Bloomberg Big Take. You can find it on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. All right, Heather, nothing like $4 trillion, right, to get folks to do something. Tell us about what's going on and why the likes of names very well known to the Bloomberg audience, Apollo, Blackstone, and many other money managers are essentially saying how high, as the Gulf sovereign wealth funds are saying jump.
Well, great question, and thanks for having me. Really what's happening is a kind of shift in power. When you have the money, you can make the rules. And because the U.S. pensions are pretty tapped out, they've given a lot of their money to these private equity firms and hedge funds and have it in these longer term funds so they can't get it back. That leaves this huge pool of money in the Middle East. And a lot of the largest asset managers have been going there for many, many years, but now these guys kind of have the upper hand. So they are asking for more, not just fee reductions, but more bodies on the ground, local offices, and they're really trying to push the limits of what they can get from these global fund managers.
Everything is political, unfortunately, and as Carol often reminds us, complicated in terms of the way that we talk about things. Things got more complicated in the fall as the start of the war between Israel and Hamas put financial diplomacy to the test. How have things changed in the last few months as a result of that ongoing war?
It feels like there are nuances that will come up and these managers will have to kind of walk a line People like Mark Rowan, CEO of Apollo, Larry Fink of BlackRock, have really been voicing a pretty strong pro-Israel stance. And in a part of the world where, in the Gulf, where a lot of these decisions on where the money goes is made by royal families, and geopolitics does kind of loom large, that complicates relationships. So it doesn't seem like there is a curb on the money flow. There's still a lot of business being done, but it disrupts the kind of when people are speaking out on one side or the other.
It also makes me think, Heather, when these guys start to report, earnings over the next couple of quarters, like, if they're getting less fees, this is something that could potentially impact the bottom line. The other thing is, right, some of these Middle Eastern sovereign funds, they're picking just a few managers. So it sounds like if you're chosen, yay. If you're not, maybe not so much. Did we lose Heather?
Absolutely. They're sort of narrowing or winnowing their relationships. So if you have one, relationship is more important. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, we gotcha. Go ahead, please. We apologize. Heather, we're going to have to break in. We so apologize. A lot of technological difficulties, and I'm having trouble speaking. So it's just in the air. But we apologize because it's a really cool story on the Bloomberg. As we said, among our most read, it's the Bloomberg Big Take. We're going to hopefully reconnect with Heather at some point and walk through this story because it really does get to trillions of dollars. We follow the money here at Bloomberg, and there's a lot of money that is in the Middle East and continuing to go in things like media and sports and just all aspects of our investing world. And it's interesting to see some of the well-known money managers that are based here in the United States, what they are doing to make sure they get a piece of that pie.
You can read Heather's story and more from Bloomberg The Big Take on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com/The Big Take. Also, don't miss the podcast, The Big Take Podcast, which does feature this story, a new era for Middle East money. You can find it at Bloomberg.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And it's really kind of upending the relationship, right? When you've got a bunch of money and you're putting it out to money managers who often are saying, yeah, I'll do this, but here's my fee. This is just how it goes. Here's the fee structure. Here's how it's going to work. But as, maybe the pool of money, certainly here in the United States, the one that they've typically tapped into, as that maybe is not so much, I'm not going to say it's drying up, but you're looking for new opportunities, right?
What do they say? Money talks?
Money, follow the money.
I've heard that before.
Money talks.
Yeah.
It always works.
Hey, speaking of money talking, we're seeing the S&P 500 higher by 1.5%. The NASDAQ right now higher by, 2.2%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 0.9%. I got a tough task ahead of me.
Yeah.
Finding decliners, Carol.
Yeah, I was just pulling up the S&P 500 in terms of getting an idea of what we are seeing in terms of breadth. And as it comes up on my Bloomberg, got 420 names to the upside, everybody, 80 to the downside. So we're seeing broad-based buying in today's trade. CPIs, we heard from Mike McKee as we kicked off Business Week on this Tuesday, really going to be very, very important to see what we get in terms of inflation and whether or not it confirms kind of the trade we're seeing today or whether it sends it off in a different direction.
Hey, speaking of a different direction, we're going to go in a different direction in just a few minutes. We're going to talk coal with Randall Atkins, founder, chairman, and CEO of Ramaco Resources.
All right, this is Bloomberg Business Week, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Starbucks struggling with weak demand and disgruntled investors, says CEO Laxman Narasimhan is stepping down after just about more than a year on the job, and that Brian Niccol, the chairman and CEO of Chipotle, will become Starbucks chairman and CEO on September 9th. Starbucks shares are 22% higher on the news. Chipotle shares are about 7% lower. U.S. wholesale inflation cooled in July, another sign that price pressures are starting to ease off. The Labor Department reported its producer price index rose 0.1% from June to July and 2.2% from a year before. And we check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is up 1.4%. That's about 77 points. NASDAQ up more than 2% now. That's about 350 points. And the Dow up 0.9%, not quite 1% yet. And that is now 359 points higher. The 10-year Treasury yield at 3.85%. And the 2-year yield at 3.94%. NYMEX crude oil down 2.3% or $1.87, now trading at $78.19 a barrel. And that is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stedevec.
Amy, thanks so much. I really do appreciate it. Well, our Bloomberg News colleague, Will Wade, writing this week that even as temperatures on Earth smash new records and scientists warn the climate is reaching dangerous tipping points, the amount of coal being consumed keeps on growing. The basic problem is simple. Whenever the security of electricity supply is in doubt, Will writes, the imperative to contain global warming slips down the agenda. Coal, we should note, is the biggest source of electricity. It accounts for 35% of the world's generation in 2023. That's according to Embark, a climate think tank.
All right, so Randall Atkins knows all about this. He's founder, chairman, and CEO of Ramaco Resources, a publicly held $650 million market cap company that produces metallurgical coal. It's the type of coal used in steel making. Companies also, in their words, exploring domestic production of rare earth elements, which is what we are super interested in. To hear a little bit more about, Randall joins us from Bluefield Coal Symposium in West Virginia. Randall, great to have you here with us. What, you want to keep it up?
I just want to start with the nuance here, because and this is what I wanted. This was a really important conversation that I had with Alex Steele ahead of this interview, because I don't talk about coal every day.
No, you don't, but you guys were like going head to head.
I did some research. I talked to Alex. Randall, there's important nuance here. I talked about electricity generation in my intro. But because that's when we talk about coal that's used for electricity generation, we're talking about thermal coal. You produce metallurgical coal. So explain the nuance here.
Sure. Well, as we say, first of all, we actually have come up with a new name. We don't call it coal. We call it carbon ore because we essentially approach it as to what its use is being from an underlying perspective. So you're absolutely correct. There's sort of three legs to the stool, as we call it, for coal use. One is obviously for combustion and power. One is basically to make steel used in blast furnaces. And frankly, the third and somewhat less understood use is what we call advanced coal products and materials, which also include critical minerals and rare earth. So that's sort of what we've been paying a lot of attention to for about the last 12 years.
Randall, can all coal be each of these three?
So in a simple answer, all coals are not created equal.
Good.
So they're distinguished by chemical properties, and the chemical properties then somewhat dictate their best and highest use. But what we've discovered is, at least for the third use, coal to advanced carbon products and materials, those can be made from either thermal or met coal.
Okay, so let's move to rare earths and talk a little bit about what's going on in your mind, where you acquired it for several $1 million, but there was this fascinating story in the Wall Street Journal back in the fall about how if everything sort of goes in your direction, there could be tens of billions of dollars worth of rare earths in that mine. What's going on there?
Well, the greatest expression is better to be lucky than smart sometimes, isn't it? So we bought this old thermal coal mine, and frankly, it took about 1.5 years to figure out that making a new thermal coal mine for utility use was somewhat of a losing proposition to deploy capital on. So we pivoted and frankly took a technology route to try to figure out what else coal could be used for. That brought us into touch with a couple of the Department of Energy national labs, and they worked with us on not only carbon products, but we're exploring, frankly, on behalf of the Defense Department, where rare earths might be found in the U.S. There's always been a thesis that they could be found in coal, but it had never been shown or proven. So we sent them some samples, took them about a year and a half. Lo and behold, they come back and said, look, we found higher concentrations of rare earths in your deposits than any place we've seen outside of Western China. So that's put us on this odyssey to where we stand today, where we're hoping to actually be in a position to start a demonstration facility next year to actually go into production and refining of rare earths that we already have a permit on that come from coal and the carbon material sort of around it. Most rare earths comes from hard minerals, uraniums, cobalts, lithiums, which frankly are radioactive when you mine them. And so that's why all the rare earths, frankly, are sent to China for processing, which is sort of self-defeating. So if we're able to actually produce rare earths from coal here in the U.S. and process them here in the U.S., that's going to be a distinct advantage.
Randall, I'm wondering if it's fair to say that if everything goes according to plan with the mine that could have rare earths, would you move away completely from traditional coal mining?
Well, I think the interesting thing is it's frankly one and the same in our case, because we're mining the coal to get to the rare earths.
So, explain how that processing exactly works. I know you mentioned that
Sure.
it had to be previously sent to China, but how do you pull it off here in the U.S.?
Sure. Nothing simple, but the way it works is we basically mine the coal. The rare earths are actually contained in minerals in the coal. So what we would do is then process the rare earths out of the coal by, frankly, a pyrolysis or a heating process, and then do various forms of separation. So in essence, even though we're still in the coal mining business, the end product is really rare earths.
I'm looking at a stat that says China produces 60% of the world's rare earths, but processes nearly 90%, which means that it's importing rare earths from other countries and processing them. So what you're saying is we not only have to produce them, but we have to process them. That's really important. What I'm curious about is what's the potential of your mine? What's the cost to bring it to potential? And what are the guarantees that you can actually spend the money and get to that potential?
Sure. Well, to kind of break it down, what you do in a mine of this nature is you go through a fairly complex techno-economic analysis, which, breaks down not only the mining, but also the processing and refinement and, discover what each part of that component production costs. We'll have that prepared by the end of the year with Fluor and Company, who's kind of advising us on that. We've got a pretty good sense of it right now, so we know that we think it is commercial. We obviously want to get down to the detail because before, as a public company, we start throwing numbers out. We want to have some independent confirmation. But we think it will be commercial, basically, even at today's prices, which are a little bit manipulated by China, who tries to keep all the competition off the field. And if we're able to do this and process it in the United States, needless to say, becomes very important strategically because, frankly, as I was just saying to this group here, when the Defense Department needs to get rare earths for our hypersonic missiles and drones, they unfortunately at this point have to call a procurement office in China. So that doesn't always work out quite well. So
what's the potential in terms of this mine and what it might produce and what it might be worth?
Sure. So I think the initial numbers we have were that it's got probably north of 1.5 million tons of rare earths, which are concentrated mostly in the heavy and medium magnetic rare earths, which are the more valuable. For some context, the U.S. uses only about 10,000 tons a year. So if we've got 1.5 million plus, it's a long-term supply.
Right.
So I think that's the critical advantage that the government is trying to incent us to pursue this mine, because it could solve potentially a lot of supply problems. And then in terms of the ultimate value, needless to say, rare earths sell for a great deal more than a ton of coal. Some of the critical minerals and rare earths we've got sell for around $1 million or more a ton. So compare that to coal that sells for thermal purposes out west for $15 a ton, or even metallurgic coal for, say, $200 a ton, and you get kind of a sense.
Hey, Randall, we're talking a lot about the government, and one thing that comes to mind is what a change in administration would mean for your company. How are you thinking about the election?
Well, needless to say, in general, as somebody who's, a student of the coal industry, times were a little bit more comfortable under Republican administrations than they have been under Democratic administrations. I would say, the main pushback, of course, against coal is its use as a combustion fuel. There's less pushback for metallurgic purposes, and frankly, for rare earth purposes, there should be none at all. And I think the interesting thing, administrations may come and go, but as far as the strategic requirement, particularly for rare earth, I think that cuts across political boundaries. So, obviously, we're already permitted. We're in the process of, starting our initial development, and we'll deal with whatever political landscape is out there.
Hey, Randall, the elephant in the room here that I kind of opened with this is climate change, and it's known that coal is the dirtiest of fossil fuels, and I'm wondering how you think about that in terms of, quote unquote, clean coal. How do you make burning coal release less emissions? Is that possible to make clean coal?
Yeah, well, we basically have come up with, a lot of one-liners, one of which is coal is too valuable to burn, another which is what we call the cure for coal. And essentially the cure for coal is that you've got to do several things at once. You've got to basically have a solution that speaks to the decarbonization of the commodity. You've got to do something that basically, supplies the value proposition or greater than it does now, and you need to be able to supply that in volumes that, make it sense for the coal business. That's why we've kind of turned to this use of coal as a precursor to make advanced carbon products and materials. These are things like graphite, synthetic graphite, graphene, carbon fibers, a lot of things that historically have been made from petroleum, but you can make them chemically from coal, and you can make them from coal at a vastly lower price than using petroleum. The interesting stat is that there's the same amount of carbon in a ton of coal as there is in a ton of petroleum. A ton of petroleum is like 7 barrels. So you use $80 a barrel, you're at, $540 for a ton of carbon versus 15 for coal. So when you think about use of things like carbon fibers, which have properties that are frankly superior to steel in terms of lightweighting, that type of thing, it's a fairly compelling economic argument to use coal.
All right, we certainly could continue. There's lots more, certainly when it comes to environmental impact, but hopefully next time. Randall Atkins, we hope we can continue this conversation. Founder, Chairman, and CEO of Ramaco Resources. This is Bloomberg.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are higher. The Dow, S&P, NASDAQ all gaining. Let's head over to the First Word breaking news desk now for today's afternoon call. Here's Bill Maloney.
Seriously, was it like a jail thing? Good afternoon, Charlie. Stocks with a bid today, helped by a weaker than expected producer price index. Dow's currently up 390 points. S&Ps are higher by 80, while the NASDAQ rises by 2.2%. The U.S. 10-year yield falls to 3.84%. Gold is down 6. Oil is slumping. And Bitcoin, that's higher by 2.9%. Regarding the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were tech and consumer discretionary. Energy was under pressure. And leaders to the upside in the Dow, Nike and Intel, while Walmart fell 1.3% and led to the downside. In other news, Starbucks soared the most ever after tapping Chipotle's nickel as its next CEO. And in the tech space, NVIDIA gained another 6%, adding $400 billion in market cap over the last 4 days. Wrapping things up, Home Depot gained after earnings following a negative open. Back to you, Amy.
All right, thank you, Bill. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type SQUA on your Bloomberg terminal, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, 18 minutes or so to go until we wrap up the
Freaky
Tuesday.
Friday.
No, it's
not Freaky Friday.
I don't know. I don't even know what to call it.
Taco Tuesday.
I'm looking for a Taco Tuesday.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chipotle. Moving on to Starbucks. All right, we're pretty much hovering near our highs of the session. We've seen investors move into both stocks and bonds, which doesn't typically happen, but here we go on this Taco Tuesday. So let's get to it with Aaron Kennan, co-founder and CEO over at Clear Harbor Asset Management. They've got $1.5 billion in assets under management. Joining us once again from Stamford, Connecticut. Forgive us, it's a little bit of a wacky day. Aaron, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me back.
It's always
Hope you're both doing well too.
We're hanging in there. The recent bout of volatility, a week ago or so, we would have been having a very different conversation, the three of us. Was that volatility that we saw 1 week ago yesterday noteworthy or to be considered expected, considering the run-up that we've seen in the overall equity markets and in particular in some specific names?
Well, that's a great question, Carol. I think at the end of the day, we're at a point of transition on a monetary policy front, and we may be at a point of transition on an economic growth front. And we know what we saw a week ago was a huge sort of shuttering of markets, and really what sparked that was a major transition in monetary policy in Japan. And, I think that while our economic picture is decelerating, there's hope for a soft landing. We've seen nice disinflationary trends, which are now leading the market to conclude that the Fed is going to cut rates in September. There were even calls last week in the middle of the spike in volatility to 65 on the VIX for the Fed to cut intermeeting. But I do think the Fed should cut, and I think they should probably start when they said they will, which will be September. And I think where maybe there's some nuance that may be helpful to ponder is the degree to which the U.S. dollar relative to the yen could trigger another round of yen carry unwinding. And certainly monetary policy officials would not welcome that, and neither would investors. And so that leads me to think that maybe the Fed cuts in September, but it's a much more gradual cut unless the economic data really surprises significantly to the downside here in the U.S., so as to not, have a huge gap between rates in Japan relative to the United States, and therefore have the yen be in a position where it will really appreciate quite significantly. We had a nearly 11% appreciation in the yen just over the last couple of weeks, and I think that was, to a great extent what has triggered so much of that volatility that we saw last week.
Aaron, when you say gradual cuts, do you mean 25 basis points in September and then maybe two more 25 basis point cuts, so you have 75 bips by the end of the year?
Yeah, and again, I'm sort of making this point that if the Fed is of the view, which I'm sure they are, that yes, they have a dual mandate, but they have to think about what happens to employment in what happens to pricing if volatility were to spike, if investors were to become rattled, if consumers therefore were to become rattled as well. And so while I would be in the camp of, without having to worry about the yen unwind, if that were not an issue, or global capital markets more generally, of maybe a slightly more aggressive approach to cutting rates over the next quarter to two, maybe they'll perhaps be taking their time so as to not alter this sort of relationship in dollar yen to any great degree going forward. We know the Bank of Japan essentially signaled to the market after the 12% slump in the Nikkei in just one day last week that maybe they'll be a little more cautious. They won't hike rates as aggressively, and so that was an interesting marker across the pond for sure.
So I am curious, Aaron, are pullbacks opportunities to buy, or are they time to rethink kind of your asset allocation?
I mean, I always think, when in the context of an overall sort of multi-asset class portfolio for the types of clients that we manage money for here at Clear Harbor, sort of the high net worth, ultra high net worth, non-for-profit clients, you always want to know what's your target allocation? Are you under that at the position level, at the asset class level? Are you over it? Is there a time to sort of rebalance? And oftentimes when there's a market swoon like that, it's a time to sort of think about, adding to things that perhaps you were slightly underweight. It's also a time to think about, correlations. When volatility rises, things tend to correlate again, particularly on the day when that spike occurs. But to sort of think about correlations during times of uncertainty, but also during times of normalization. And so I think, going forward too, what we believe to be the case is, on the fixed income side, maybe moving duration a little further out the curve. I think a lot of fixed income dollars with individuals and even some institutions is hugging the sort of 1 to 6 month part of the curve in the form of treasury bills. And, maybe moving away from that notion. If you look at treasury bills even today, you can go out to 3 months and yield 5%. But now, unlike just a couple of weeks ago, you have a 4 handle on your treasury bills. So you may want to be thinking about moving out the curve. Maybe not to 10 years or 30 years, but certainly 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Because you think we've topped out? Do you think in terms of rates along the yield curve, the U.S. yield curve, do you think we've, the idea of 5 or 6, which we were talking about not so long ago, more consistently, do you think we've topped out here and that where we are right now, or where do you think we are, when it comes to the 2 and the 10 in particular?
I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but I do think that it seems as though the balance of risks would suggest more incremental weakness in the economy and more incremental weakness in employment, which would suggest that nominal rates could come down. But what I do know, just by looking at the break-even inflation rate relative to, let's say, the nominal 10-year Treasury rate, is that 10-year Treasuries are not particularly expensive right now. They're not uber cheap, but within the context of the last 2 years, they're quite attractive. And so it gives some confidence to sort of say, extending duration right now with the long-term inflation rates where they are, 10-year break-evens are only 2.09, 210 on Bloomberg Terminal today.
Yeah.
It's sort of attractive.
Okay, we got CPI tomorrow. We got retail sales coming on Thursday. Gosh, we have even more. We have quite a bit. We have so much economic data this week.
There's some interesting ones, yeah.
Yeah, we do. Aaron, just 30 seconds. What could surprise to the upside and sort of like shatter the soft landing narrative? 30 seconds.
Well, of course, if CPI is for some reason hot, which the market is not anticipating, the Treasury market's off, 5-7 basis points today, meaning prices are higher, yields are lower, and PPI, was on the softer side. That would maybe bring some pause, but it doesn't make a trend. I think the trend, if you look at core inflation, headline inflation, has been downward. A slightly elevated CPI number probably wouldn't spook the market too much. I still think September cut is in the cards. I think retail sales would be a surprise if it really overshot, given what we're seeing in earnings, whether it was today with Depot or consumer staples companies. There's a lot of caution on the consumer front right now.
All right, good to keep in mind as we go through those data points. Aaron Kennan, co-founder and CEO at Clear Harbor Asset Management, joining us as he has before from Stamford, Connecticut. They've got about $1.5 billion in assets under management. We've got just about 10 minutes left in the trading session. We're seeing some buying into the close.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg in Washington, I'm Amy Morris. Starbucks has named Chipotle Chief Executive Brian Niccol as the coffee chain's new CEO and chairman, replacing Laxman Narasimhan after just a year in that role. Jody Lurie is a credit analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Their perceived sort of support of Israel, they've now had a lot of customers sort of not go because of that.
Right.
It's been tremendous. But then you now have China where they've really expanded a lot of their stores and they haven't necessarily gotten that growth.
Jody Lurie is with Bloomberg Intelligence. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. Download it wherever you get your podcasts. Starbucks shares are now 23% higher. Chipotle shares are now more than 7% lower. High interest rates and inflation have consumers holding off buying homes or pursuing renovations that might typically need financing, and Home Depot is feeling it. The retailer lowered its forecast of a key sales metric for the year on expectations that consumers will continue to hold back spending in the coming months. Bloomberg's Preeti Gupta.
They basically said things are looking worse into the end of this year than they previously expected. Even their second quarter comp still. So if you look on it from a quarterly basis, still seeing some pain, down 3.3%. The estimate there was 2.4% as well.
Bloomberg's Preeti Gupta. Paramount Global began laying off staff this morning after the entertainment company said last week it planned to slash 15% of its U.S.-based workforce. It's about 2,000 positions. The iconic Paramount Television Studios is shutting down this week as part of those cost-cutting efforts. And shares of Tesla rose 5.5%, a day after Elon Musk sat down with Donald Trump for a conversation on X, where he asked the former president's supporters to stop demonizing electric vehicles. Shares of Trump Media now down 3.5%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, under 5 minutes left to go in the Tuesday trading session. Getting ready to head over to our TV colleagues. We're going to talk about the markets, bring you to that closing bell. On a day when you see stocks holding on to their gains, we saw a recent kick up just a few moments ago in terms of some buying into the close, but we're hovering at our highs. What do you got for me?
Have you looked at the most read in the last hour, including a story that just got pushed out to all of our phones as well?
I'm going to go there.
Go there. Most read in the last hour. It's a stock story, stock related.
You know, listen, this is so fascinating. So JP Morgan Chase, former JP Morgan Chase chief market strategist Marko Kolanovic has reemerged on social media, posting on both LinkedIn and X for the first time since reports in early July that he was leaving his role at the bank. There were stories last week about maybe he was right.
Well, I remember I saw those. I have to say, Alexander Semenova has been all over this story. The closely followed strategist made a name for himself with warnings about 2015's stock slump and 2018's volatility blow-up. Though his most recent pessimistic views failed to materialize. Separate post today, he offered a bearish take, saying markets face issues ranging from the U.S. presidential election to geopolitics, the Somme rule recession indicator, the potential for increasing bankruptcies and credit card delinquencies.
Now go back to July 3rd and news of his exit with, and Alexandra was all over this, reporting about this. I can't remember if it was an exclusive that she broke.
Oh, yeah, she had it.
Right, that Kolanovic was leaving, and that was back again in early July. It did send shockwaves across Wall Street. Some traders and strategists were wondering during last week's rout if his departure was a sign of a market top. He was at JP Morgan for 19 years, but he was so pessimistic in a market that just seemed to go higher and higher and higher. And so it was kind of, our headline was, Kolanovic got booted as Street's last bear. Now he looks right. I mean, this was one of the stories that we were talking about, or she wrote last week.
The story came out at 3:23. It's the most read story in the last hour. It is a push alert. If you looked at your phone or look at your phone and you have Bloomberg notifications,
time will tell.
There.
Time will tell. Like, we'll see where the market goes.
People
I mean,
love reading about him.
I think as long as the expectations that the Fed is going to start cutting in September and that growth continues and inflation stays down, that could be a very good environment for the economy and stocks. But time will tell. Tick, tick,
Marco,
tick, tick, tick.
Hey, you can come on our show if you'd like to.
Yeah, we would definitely love. You can do social media, but you can also come to us. All right, everybody, it's time to head over to our TV colleagues. Let's count you down to the close on this Tuesday. The closing bell starts right now.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close, starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic here with Alex Seal, taking you through the closing bell. It's a global simulcast, starting now with Scarlett Fu here in the TV studio, Carol Master and Tim Stenovic in the radio booth, as we welcome our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, including our partnership with YouTube, Carol Master.
Yeah.
You're smiling.
Why
Is that
not?
because you're looking at the green
big
on the
YouTube
screen?
fan.
It's sunny outside. It's not raining. The humidity has come down. And the VIX, look, we lost about 2.5 points. We're down below 20 again. So everything is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, the PPI came in.
Famous last words there.
Fed
Yeah,
friendly,
exactly.
everything is awesome. Plop.
Ish.
Yeah, ish. It was Fed friendly report. All eyes now to CPI tomorrow. We'll see what happens. But look at all the green on the screen. Investors optimistic.
The soft landing narrative is back. It's like, the global market meltdown didn't actually happen.
Guys, but then we're still seeing a huge bid into the bond market. That feels to me, is that still a fear factor? Or is that just, hey, Feds are going to cut. It's all great. It's still the soft landing. I'm skeptical, guys. I'm skeptical.
That's a great point, right? We saw both bond and stocks moving higher today, right? I thought they weren't supposed to do that.
Buy all this stuff.
Yeah, and that's the other question, too. It kind of raises this whole conundrum for the Fed. You start to look at the differential between where Treasury yields are and where the Fed's funds rate is, and then if you want to overlay the differential with where headline inflation is, or even core inflation is, I don't know, is the Fed behind the curve?
I don't know. We just spoke to Aaron Kennan over at Clear Harbor. He's cautiously optimistic that, a soft landing could be on the horizon, maybe 3 rate cuts by the end of the year, 75 bips.
Yeah. Well, a bit of risk appetite coming back into this market. You see that with the VIX tamped down, Bitcoin back above 60,000, and green for most of the major indices here in the United States of America. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up by about 400 points or 1% on the day. The S&P looks like it's going to close higher by 90 points or about 1.7%. The NASDAQ adding about 2.4% on the day, while the Russell 2000, Carol, higher by 33 points or 1.6%.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, too, to see some kind of buying into the close here. The S&P 500, Scarlett, you're going to go through the industry groups, but you have 425 names in the S&P 500 gaining ground on this Tuesday, and Scarlett, only 75 to the downside.
Yeah, it's pretty lopsided when you look at the sector performances as well. Here's the IMAP, pretty much your pesto pizza. There's some red slices there. Energy down 1%. And food and staples, also, kind of mixed right now, but really it's energy. Everything else is green, particularly tech, up 3% on the day. Consumer discretionary up 2.4%, and communication services gaining 1.5%.
That is a brat chart. I'm just going to say it.
Wow.
I know.
Very 2024.
Thank you. All right, let's get to some of the individual gainers. Starbucks finishing at its highs pretty much of the session, up 24.5%, soaring the most ever. It is your number one gainer in both the NASDAQ 100 and the S&P 500. We know the story. Chipotle CEO Brian Niccol, he will be taking over the top spot in September. Big deal. We know the activist investor Starboard has been looking for some kind of shakeup, but nonetheless, all eyes and ears going to be watching on this one and what it does to kind of change around some of the metrics that haven't been so good. I mean, this company, 2 straight quarters of comparable sales declines. We've seen the stock under pressure, so not today. Very different narrative around Starbucks. All right, Supermicro, also an outperformer in today's session, finishing the day with a gain of about 5% here, top in the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. I got to be honest, not sure why some investors may be looking forward to some upcoming investor conferences in August and September in which the company is participating. Maybe there's some news that comes out of it. Our BI team, though, was
remember,
out with
Carol,
a note.
they had pulled out. Remember, there was a lot of concern that they had pulled,
okay.
and now they're basically saying they're going back in. So, I don't know, let the speculation
This is why
begin.
we have you, to keep me honest.
Is this why you have us? I thought it was just to get you coffee and tea.
That too. Our BI team also out with a research note on Supermicro, saying that the company is poised for sustained AI sales and EPS lift through 2025. And one more on holding, up about 4.3%, well off its highs of the day. At its highs, up more than 9%.
Is this the semiconductor company or the shoe company?
No, on holding, the shoe, the ticker on.
Roger Federer wears them. It's his sneaker company.
Carol Master wears them too, so don't make fun of me. I know some
You would
people-
never. They're apparently really cool.
There you go.
Thank you. Phew. I was a little worried. It also brought names like Nike, Foot Locker, Dick's Sporting Goods, and Under Armour also moving to the upside as a result. On holding, they were down initially in the pre-market, but finishing the day, as we said, up. Second quarter sales topped estimates. They did have a small profit miss, but nonetheless, the company also did back its full-year guidance of at least 30% sales growth. So there you go.
All right. You got the gainers. I got a couple decliners, and
it was hard, right?
Yeah, it was actually so hard that
looks
one
like
of
a
my
meeting on one of those.
decliners turned into a gainer, guys.
Just barely.
Just barely. I'm busted.
Okay, you
That's
want
what
to
happens.
start from the bottom and go up? Or
No, I want to start with Chipotle. Start with something firmly in the red today. Shares fell as much as 14%. At one point, it was the most intraday since March of 2017. This after the company said chair and CEO Brian Niccol is going to leave the company at the end of the month. He's going to become chair and CEO of Starbucks. We just heard that from Carol. Starbucks, for its part, or Chipotle for its part, rather, COO Scott Boatwright was named Chipotle's interim CEO. Analysts acknowledge Niccol's departure adds uncertainty, though they are confident in the outlook for the company given its leadership team. Also, keep an eye on shares of Baxter International. Ended up falling 6.55% today. The company said it's selling its kidney care segment to global investment firm Carlyle for $3.8 billion. Investors, though, Alex, it seemed, wanted more. Shares falling by 6.5%.
All right, taking a look at the bond market, there was some moves here, buying all across the curve, particularly in the front end. I think I said exactly those same words yesterday as well. We're at the lowest level for yields since the beginning of August. So quite interesting there, guys. We're down for about 2 straight days. I feel like this sets us up. I wonder how clean positions will be as we head into CPI.
Yeah, it's a really good point, right? We'll see whether or not how tested they might be. All right, guys, let's get to some stories that have definitely caught our attention. Once again, some data out showing gender differences, and once again showing women being more flexible than men. Just kind of put that out there.
That's why you picked the story.
You got it. All right, there's a gender divide in how recent college grads are responding to a cooling U.S. jobs market. It turns out college-educated women are sticking with their jobs and their job search, even as the number of vacancies shrinks. Many of their male peers are choosing, Tim, to take a break and maybe back off of it.
Yeah, so 1 in 5 under the age of 25 are neither employed nor actively looking for work. This according to the latest 12-month average in a Bloomberg News analysis of government data. It contrasts, Scarlett, with the data for female grads. It shows their participation rate is holding broadly steady over the past few years.
And the reason, as Carol alluded to, women are more flexible in that they're more likely than men to take on part-time work, or maybe something that they're overqualified for, or maybe not their first choice, but they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to work, I'm going to support myself, and then I'll trade up as I, continue along.
I don't get it. So then what do the men do? So if they're going to take a break, like, what are they doing?
They're living with mom and dad.
Like, how do they eat and buy stuff?
Out.
Mom and dad.
Well, but it does also sort of illustrate something bigger about the economy, and that job market is cooling. So not just for recent college grads, but look at the July payrolls report. I mean, this is exactly what the Fed wanted to have happen to cool the labor market, to cool the economy, bring inflation down. But there's some implications for those college graduates entering the workforce.
Did you see where it also said, oh, wait, women are better than men? I don't know if you saw that, paragraph 5. All right, all yours.
Wow, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. But I guess we're outnumbered here, Tim, 3-2 here. Speaking of which, Carol, the next proposal that you get from a significant other, it might not be with the real diamond ring.
I'm done.
I don't know. Who knows? But you never know, Carol. And apparently, a lot of the companies out there, including Pandora, the CEO, is actually a little bit concerned here about the rise of lab-grown diamonds. They've really caught on now. Remember, when this first started, everyone kind of just thought it was kind of a gimmick. The uptake was really low, like 1 or 2% of sales. Now we're up to like 20% of sales. And the CEO of Pandora says that could grow to like 80% of sales within the next decade or so.
Yeah, and it's a pretty incredible, this move within 10 years. I know my brother proposed to his fiancée, and she specifically requested a lab-grown diamond, and he had to go all over the diamond district to look for one.
Actually, funny you say that. I also know people who've done that too. They're like, don't spend the money on a real diamond. That's ridiculous. Get something shiny and pretty, and then we'll just do it that way. But I'm with Romaine on this. I feel like this has been a slow burn. I remember doing segments about this like 15 years ago, and it was like, no one's actually going to buy this. And now, boom, finally.
So what has changed? Have consumer interests changed?
Money?
Or is it because prices?
Well, based on what I've seen, they're significantly cheaper. And if you can't tell the difference, like I couldn't as a layman, you can't tell the difference. Why wouldn't you do it?
I think it's a great thing. I think there's a lot of controversy and things around diamonds and what you have to do to kind of find them. So, that's fine with me. So the next time I get, a proposal or get married, it'll
kind of wish this would have been a thing just a few years ago when I was going through this whole process.
Oh, yeah.
Anniversary rings, Tim.
Yeah.
Anniversary rings.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Good call.
On that note, we're going to say goodbye. All right, that's a wrap for our cross-platform coverage. Radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We call it, what do we call it? Oh, yeah, the closing bell.
What do we call it?
It's just that kind of a day. All right.
Thinking about her diamonds.
It's Tuesday.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Goodbye,
Tuesday.
girl.
All right, goodbye, everybody.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Reality TV stars are freezing their eggs on camera. Lawmakers in D.C. are debating federal protection for IVF. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in slick startups that market fertility treatments for all. But this rapid growth has revealed cracks in the system. Misconception, it's a new series from Bloomberg's Prognosis, follows reporter Kristen V. Brown on her own intimate journey as she uncovers the business of fertility. Here's a little bit of it.
I was feeling nervous because I'd never had any kind of surgery before. And at this point in the process, it was clear that freezing eggs or embryos is a serious medical procedure. I was also nervous because I didn't know if it would work.
I know I'm not going to get like 20 eggs because I don't even seem to have 20 follicles, but I'm hoping that there's like 10 good mature ones. I think that's like a pretty conservative hope. I think at the max, maybe I could get like 15 or 16. At my age, that would be amazing. That's like, you go, ovaries, you go.
That's Kristen V. Brown, and that's a clip from the final episode of the Misconception podcast, Inside the Labyrinth of America's Fertility Business. We don't want to give everything away, Kristen, but it's where you find your results.
Yes, I find out. And also my husband finds out on tape the results, which is entertaining.
Wow, that's brave.
He's a brave man.
Wow. Remind everybody about, what you've been going through and what you've been laying out and why.
Yeah, so last summer, I was in my mid-30s. My husband and I were living on 2 different continents. We were not married at the time. And I was really panicked about our chances of starting a family as a person whose biological clock was, rapidly headed towards the proverbial cliff. And so we decided to, at first I was going to freeze eggs, and then we decided to freeze embryos together. And this podcast series, follows me on that journey, but it also really gets into what that journey entails and why we have this industry that is so convoluted, and yet, so many hundreds of thousands of women are seeking out every year now.
People who have followed the series understand what you've gone through, or people who have gone through this or their partners have gone through this understand lots of doctor's visits, hormones, injections, invasive procedures. That's to name just a little bit. What does the science tell us, and what did you learn about how maybe this could be easier for future generations?
Yeah, I think one thing that I thought was so interesting, I got to visit a lab and...
CCRM,
yeah. And it was so manual. You were watching these people use, their human hands and eyes to do this stuff like fertilize an embryo, use a laser to blast a tiny piece off and send it into a lab to be biopsied. And I honestly had thought it was all way more high-tech than that. I assumed they were just like robots because, I just kept thinking about myself, after a glass of wine the night before. My hands would be shaking. I would blast somebody's embryo to smithereens. And so, and it hasn't really changed that much in the last couple decades. But we're just getting to this point where there are scientists and companies that are starting to rethink aspects of the procedure. There's one company that's really close to figuring out how to use robotics to do a lot of what an embryologist does, right? So a robot fertilizes the egg. A robot uses AI to select the best sperm. There is a company that's trying to figure out how to make it a less brutal process for women. It's called Gameto. They are trying to figure out how to make it so that you don't have to take all the drugs. Maybe you take drugs for a day or 2 instead of 10. And as any woman who's been through this can tell you, the drugs are the brutal, horrible part. And there's even companies that are trying to figure out how to extend a woman's biological clock
period to end, so we don't have to go through any of this. So we're at this really exciting, interesting time, I think, where we might get some new tools available to us.
Getting better, like there is an evolution in this, correct? In terms of the technology of like where it started, like.
Well, there hasn't been much of one
Or there
yet.
hasn't been, that's what I find is interesting. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have, it works a lot of the time. And I think that it's hard to innovate in an industry where there's not a lot of federal funding for the basic science research, because funding of anything involving embryos is blocked at the federal level in the United States. So it's hard to get the money for people to do the research that would then result in innovations. And so we've just wound up doing versions of the same procedure for decades.
Because it's a big business. I mean,
it is big business.
I'm
$40 billion business.
I'm amazed at the number of young individuals, and maybe it's just because the technology and science are there today, that in order to have a family, they're often tapping into some part of this.
Yeah, and it's a growing number of people, right? Because so many people like myself are putting off, marriage and starting a family until later and later.
Is it really just the older age?
I think a lot of it is the older age. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly part of it, but I also think that, I don't know, there's this idea that 30, 40 years ago, this technology wasn't there, and there were a lot of couples who didn't have this option.
Yeah, they didn't have this option. Maybe they would have been able to adopt, but of course that can be difficult too. So, I mean, this technology has been a boon in that way, right? It's allowed so many people access to starting a family that may not have been able to do it 30 years ago. But I think people are also realizing there's room for improvement, and that's where we are right now.
Okay, go ahead.
No, go, please.
I wanted to talk about the private equity side of this and the money side of this, which your research has certainly gotten into, the business of it. You mentioned the billions of dollars. What did you learn about sort of the web of companies that are involved in this, and public versus private markets, and sort of, this is healthcare we're talking about.
This is healthcare, and like many aspects of healthcare, there's more and more private equity. More clinics are becoming part of, private equity venture-funded clinic chains. One of the big ones that, if you're a woman in your 30s, you have probably gotten Instagram ads for is Kindbody. They're have that Silicon Valley sheen, and I think that some people do feel like that's changed the industry, but the question is how it's changed it, right? There is the opportunity for these kinds of companies to, bring down costs, to standardize stuff, right? And that could be better for patients, but there's also the opportunity to just sort of turn it into a churn in which the individual patient gets lost and you're not really giving the individual the care that they need.
As you've gone through this process, and it's so personal, what questions do you still have about it, the process, the industry, that weren't answered, that you'd love to have some answers on?
So the thing, as I was laying there on all these drugs, just like so mad at my body and at the world, and just like, why am I doing this? The thing that I kept thinking about is, why are we in this position where this is the best option for so many women, families, couples in starting a family, right? Either because you missed the window to get pregnant easily, naturally, and you're doing IVF, or because you're worried you're going to miss it, and so you're freezing eggs or embryos like I did. And the thing that really stuck with me is we keep throwing technology at a social problem, right? So much of this, not all of it, but a lot of it is because people are starting families later. And the solution seems to be to make it easier to start families later. But the problem isn't actually women's biology. And I kept thinking about that. And that's the thing that sort of gnawed at me. So making it
easier to start a family earlier.
Yeah, right. Like if that would solve a lot of the problem for a lot of people, right? So that was the thing that really gnawed at me through this whole thing.
Yeah, it's a really kind of fascinating thing. I mean, I don't know. And it just seems like more and more people will continue, though, to tap into it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, now they're advertising egg freezing to really young women, right, in their 20s.
I feel like I see it on the trains and things all the time.
Yeah. And so it's already women who are just getting out of college are worried that their biological clock is going to expire before they start a family when they have like 15 years still.
It's like one of the things, like, let's just do it just in case, right?
Yeah, let's just put your body
They're
through.
certainly preying on something.
Yeah.
Hey, Kristen V. Brown, a big thank you to Bloomberg Healthcare Reporter. Check out the Misconception podcast at Bloomberg.com or on Apple Podcasts. Coming up next, we're joined by the New York Times correspondent. She's got a new book out, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. That's next on Business Week.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. The S&P notched its biggest four-day rally this year. And while stocks rallied, bond yields fell after the latest U.S. inflation reading reinforced speculation that the Federal Reserve will be able to deploy its widely anticipated interest rate cut in September. Just 24 hours ahead of the consumer inflation report. Data showed the producer price index rose less than forecast. And we check those closing numbers for you each day here at Bloomberg. The Dow gained 409 points, NASDAQ up 407, S&P 500 up 90, the 10-year Treasury yield at 3.84%, and the 2-year yield at 3.94%. U.S. banks erased $150 billion of unrealized losses since the start of the third quarter and shrunk them by nearly half since 2022, offering a silver lining for the industry as economic growth slows. That's according to Wells Fargo and Company analyst Mike Mayo. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flag.
the words you think of when you hear the name Bill Gates? Tech visionary?
Check.
Innovator?
Yep.
Philanthropist?
Totally.
I don't know. Maybe some people would think vaccine microchip implants.
Yeah.
Truly.
Supporter of nuclear energy.
Yeah, that's one too.
A lot of stuff.
That's a phrase.
Yeah.
How about billionaire, nerd, savior, and king?
Also works.
That's the title of a new book by Anuprita Das, South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. It focuses on the life of what many would consider a pretty complicated and extremely accomplished individual.
Got it. Nailed. Anuprita Das joins us now from New York. The full title of her book, by the way, is, as you just said, Billionaire, Nerd, Savior, King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. It is out today. Prita, it is so nice to have you here on Bloomberg Business Week. I always think about a book like this, someone very well known. We talk about Bill Gates a lot here at Bloomberg. Why did you write this book? What was it about Gates beyond being one of the world's richest and most recognizable? Was there one specific event, or just why did you do it?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Two stories. One is that when, in 2014, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I came across Bill Gates' fortune and the investment firm that manages it. Now, very few people knew about it. It's called Cascade. And the way his money was invested from all kinds of assets made it interesting because it was like an investment firm, but belonging to one man. And so in 2021, I'd moved to the Times, and then I got pulled into the reporting when the divorce of Bill and Melinda happened because I had this context for their fortune. And so that then got me thinking about, who is this man? You know, we'd always thought, as you said, you know, we'd always thought of him in all these different ways, but, you know, who is he behind all of these kind of images? So in 2021, that was my aha moment, and I thought it's worth investigating the persona and the man.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here because it's 4 decades in public life, and he's done a lot, not just when it comes to building Microsoft, but also, of course, philanthropy. I loved the excerpt of the book in the New York Times just a few days ago about his evolving relationship with Warren Buffett. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you reported not just that part of the book, but also who you spoke to paint this portrait of this complicated person?
I mean, I can't divulge my sources, but outside of that,
you can. You can if you want.
You know what we want. Did Warren talk to you?
Well, Warren spoke on the record. You know, he is, in fact, you know, I used to cover, again, a lot of this goes back to the Journal when I was a reporter. You know, I used to write about Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. So the relationship of the two men was also equally interesting. The first time I saw them at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, just kind of walking around, you know, talking to shareholders. And it just struck me as kind of a, you know, a very casual but very intimate friendship. And then I began looking at it and seeing that, you know, each has talked about the other and sort of the magic of their friendship decades. And, you know, Bill Gates definitely has kind of advertised that piece of it. It's almost like part of his brand. Every year, nearly every year, on Gates Notes, his blog, he posts something like a goofy video or a post dedicated to Buffett. And so that was really interesting to me. But in recent years, I think once Buffett decided that he had always said that he wasn't going to give his money to anyone. He hadn't decided who he was going to give his money to after his death. But there was always like an assumption that the Gates Foundation stood to get all of that money. And when he eventually decided who was going to get that money after he died, it was not going to be the Gates Foundation. And so I think there was a little bit of tension there that I tried to capture in that piece that the Times ran. And it was, you know, I think they have very different lifestyles. Buffett, as I'm sure you guys know, is kind of more folksy, simple sort of person, very Midwestern. And then Gates has more of the traditional trappings of a billionaire. So it was interesting to see their divergent paths, but also examine the basis of their friendship.
You know, you said earlier about, you know, you wanted to kind of dig into the persona and the man. Are they that different?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that plays into a lot of what we in the media, how we and what we write and what we choose to write feeds into the image of a person who's in the public eye, in the sense that you interact with someone, you see him or her in a closed setting, you get more of a sense of who they are and based on interactions, based on your sources, you start creating this image of a person in the media. So it's true, the persona is based on many fundamental elements of who the person is, but then it also takes on its own life. And then if you're a billionaire or you have like a lot of resources that you can dedicate to that, then I think you're basically sustaining, nurturing, minimizing, enhancing certain aspects of that image to really suit your needs and ends. And this isn't necessarily nefarious, but it's just what image making can do. And so I think there are elements of a person's internal personality or like in closed settings, and then how that feeds into a persona and how then people kind of keep manufacturing and finessing it, which to me was really interesting about Gates.
Did you like him as you did this process?
Well, he didn't grant me an interview, so that, I couldn't tell you any more than that. But
you talked to a lot of people about him, and
I did,
we can
of
get
course.
a picture of someone maybe clearer than the narrative that's out there publicly.
Absolutely. I think what was most interesting to me is that the essential person has not changed, right? He's mellowed, obviously, over the decades, we all do. But his essential personality, the way he's obviously supremely smart, but he can sometimes be abrasive. He can be impatient with employees. He enjoys, working in a combative culture, and that was the case at Microsoft, and that is also the case of the Gates Foundation. Except that what happens is that Microsoft rewarded that sort of competitive culture, whereas the Gates Foundation, I think people come from very different backgrounds, so it sat uncomfortably inside the Gates Foundation, but it struck me as really interesting that he was essentially the same person, but he had also changed his image over the decades, to find that continuity, the consistency in so many ways, but to then place it against how we looked at him as a nerd, as this sort of ruthless monopolist, as this, philanthropist.
Rockefeller, like robber baron kind of thing,
Like,
as you write
right,
about.
Absolutely.
What was the antitrust? Was the antitrust issue at Microsoft, was that a pivotal turning point for him, or when do you think this metamorphosis or transformation began?
Yeah, it did. I think he had always said that he was going to give the bulk of his fortune to philanthropy. I think the time hadn't been decided. And you have to remember that in the 1990s, there was only Microsoft. Now we think about Google and Amazon and Facebook and a lot of companies that are facing similar antitrust scrutiny. But in the 1990s, the second half of the 90s, Microsoft was it. It was the company that captured everyone's imagination. But also, and as a result of that, I think Gates's performance, even though we didn't have social media then and we didn't have viral moments, Gates's performance riveted the nation, and people realized that this was a man who had become a distraction for Microsoft. So I think it made sense for him to then step down from the CEO role in 2000. And also he was tired. I think he said, a source of mine told me that he was tired, didn't know where else to go. And he just also felt that Microsoft was a shining example of American innovation, and why was the government going against him? And so I think there was a lot of confusion and a lot of pain. And then he turned to philanthropy because it was there. It was something he had always intended to do. And he found that he really liked it. And then it was go big or go home, because that's who Gates is. He started Microsoft, changed the personal computing world, and now he's changed philanthropy with this mammoth foundation.
Hey, you mentioned antitrust. There's a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal right now. Kind of perfect timing on your part, I should say. U.S. antitrust enforcers are reviewing Google remedy options in a rare bid to break up Alphabet's Google as one of the options being considered by the Justice Department after a landmark court ruling found that the company monopolized the online search market, according to people with knowledge of the deliberations.
Do you want to point out shares of Alphabet are down about 1.3% in the aftermarket. The move would be Washington's first push to dismantle a company for illegal monopolization since unsuccessful efforts to break up Microsoft. We were just talking about that. That was, of course, 2 decades ago. Less severe options include forcing Google to share more data with competitors and measures to prevent it from gaining an unfair advantage in AI products. This is according to the people who asked not to be identified discussing private conversations. Again, shares of Alphabet down about 1.5% in the aftermarket. Want to get back to, we're talking with Anuprita Das. She is a South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. Her new book, as we said, is about Bill Gates, billionaire nerd, savior king, Bill Gates and his quest to shape our world. Just get about a minute and a half and then we'll come back and talk some more. Did you find a lot of surprises in this process in terms of new things you learned about Bill Gates?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, Carol, is we didn't really understand, and I think that I think the entire world doesn't quite understand why he met with Jeffrey Epstein so many times. And the question for me that's been the most interesting to explore is that if you're Gates or if you're a billionaire, you have armies of people whose job it is to sustain and polish and nurture your image, right? Building Bill's brand is something I examine in the book. And yet you have, despite having all of these people, even a basic Google search, right, would reveal that Epstein by then was a convicted sex offender and someone who perhaps wasn't the best kind of person from an optics standpoint for a billionaire with what Gates was trying to do to interact. So that was surprising to me. It was a failure, a lapse of judgment that I wouldn't expect. But it also ties back to the personality that Gates is.
We'll continue on this because I do agree that this is an interesting aspect of certainly his story that is still being told, but that you cover so much. We're going to come back with Prita Das, her new book, Billionaire Nerd, Savior King. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week right here on Bloomberg Radio.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. This just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. The Department of Justice is considering whether to break up Google after a court ruled that the company monopolized the online search market. The move would be Washington's first push to dismantle a company for illegal monopolization since unsuccessful efforts to break up Microsoft 2 years ago. U.S. wholesale inflation cooled in July, another sign that price pressures are continuing to ease. That has traders watching for the Fed's response and whether a rate cut could come as soon as September. We check those closing numbers for you each day here at Bloomberg. The Dow is up 409 points, NASDAQ up 407, the S&P 500 up 90 points, the 10-year Treasury yield at 3.84%, and the 2-year yield at 3.93%. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic says he's looking for a little more data before he can support a reduction in interest rates, emphasizing that he wants to be sure the central bank will not have to change course once it begins cutting. Bostic reiterated the stance he's held since March, that he'll likely be ready to cut by the end of the year. And Starbucks has named a new CEO and chairman. The company appointed Chipotle's CEO Brian Niccol as its next leader, effective September 9th. The leadership shakeup comes after activist investors Elliott Investment Management and Starboard Value reportedly amassed stakes in the company. Shares of Starbucks 22% higher. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek.
Thank you so much, Amy. Appreciate that. I want to get right back to Anuprita Das. She's South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. Her new book, Billionaire Nerd Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. Prita, you were talking about Jeffrey Epstein just moments ago and the relationship that Bill Gates had with Jeffrey Epstein. And I got to tell you, the parts in your book that focus on that have gotten a lot of media attention over the last couple of weeks. Just explain what you learned about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and why they found themselves having a relationship.
Yeah, so what happened, my best reconstruction based on my reporting and documents is that in 2010, you had the Giving Pledge, which was this effort, essentially a get out the vote campaign by Gates, Warren Buffett, and Melinda French Gates to get other billionaires to commit, to pledge to commit half or more of their fortunes to charity. And at that time, a lot of billionaires were very interested in finding a way to put their money to use. Having the money is almost easier than figuring out how to give it away wisely. And so the Gates Foundation was very much set up to use billions of dollars. And Gates was in the middle of this massive push toward polio eradication. The foundation had been working with other entities, and it was one of those times when Gates wanted to raise a lot of money. So Epstein, kind of being in these circles of influence and power, he's someone who kind of collected bits and pieces of information, used leverage wherever he could, and realized that there might be an opportunity for him to pitch something called a donor advised fund. And he wrote to JP Morgan, and JP Morgan had like another relationship with the Gates Foundation. So he looked at all of this. He began pitching this idea for a donor advised fund. He reached out to people who he knew at the Gates Foundation who had an overlap with Gates, of course, and began seeking an introduction. Now, Gates took that introduction. He came and visited Epstein at his house the first time. And then there was another meeting where there was a presentation. Epstein had slides and everything. So that until then, perhaps all well and good. But after that, the fact that he kept meeting with Epstein several times, ostensibly to discuss philanthropy, and Gates has always said that that was the only reason, and that he was sorry for the lapse in judgment. But it still is a question for Gates, essentially, because he is perhaps the only person who would know why he kept going back and meeting with Epstein. There are people who say that Gates was enamored of Epstein's lifestyle. He did write to some employees of the Gates Foundation after, saying that, he does have an adventurous, different lifestyle, but it's not for me. I'm not putting words into Gates' mouth, but that was essentially the point of what he was saying. And so clearly there was maybe bemusement, maybe surprise, maybe anticipation. It's hard to say. But again, coming back to the point I was making earlier, it is a surprising lapse in judgment for the people who work for him. But for Gates himself, it's actually not that surprising, given that he does have a certain naivete when it comes to personal relationships.
Now, you said you didn't get to talk to Bill Gates, right, for the book?
No, I didn't. He turned down my request for an interview.
Were you able to, though, ask him any questions, like write and get responses, or no, nothing at all?
No. So what happened was that it was interesting because I sent them detailed fact-checking lists, both at Gates Ventures, which is a private firm, and the Gates Foundation back in January or February, months before. They stalled and stonewalled and didn't acknowledge my emails. And at the end, when I said, you have to give me a comment, they said it was hearsay. And then just weeks before we went to publication, they got back on some of the Epstein-related points, and they refuted and said that they could present documented evidence. And I asked for that, and they didn't provide anything, and the book went to print. And then the Daily Mail the Daily Mail and the New York Post put out these tidbits from my book, and they were overblown and not entirely accurate. But then Gates's private firm then put out a statement saying that it was all wild allegations, and that they presented me with documented evidence that I chose to ignore, which is not true.
Speaking of wild things that potentially could come up, I was joking at the top when I said the microchip vaccine stuff, but only half joking in the sense that these are real conspiracy theories about Bill Gates. Can you talk a little bit about where those come from and the idea of this quote-unquote Davos elite that wants to control the world?
I think the fact that Gates was so prominent suddenly everywhere. He was suddenly everywhere. He was talking about vaccines. He was sharing the stage with Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was advocating. He was kind of out there everywhere. You couldn't miss him, which led a lot of people to wonder. And I speak to, I have one person in the book who made the point that, I had always thought of Gates as the Microsoft co-founder, and suddenly why is this guy talking about vaccines? And so I think if you are prone to conspiracy theories, I think that was kind of the first sign for a lot of people that maybe Gates has some kind of vested interest. And, conspiracy theories obviously take on a life of their own. And I think there was a study, and don't quote me on this, but I think there's a study looking at the feasibility of having some information, implanted into a person's, under a person's skin. And it was an MIT feasibility study, and nothing came of it. But that led to this kind of big idea that somehow Gates was trying to, implant chips in people and kind of all manner of things. Now, I think for the vaccines, and Gates was, he's a rational guy. He's driven by evidence and science and tech, and I think he just didn't understand why there were people questioning what seemed to him very obvious steps. He couldn't understand being a personal target of the conspiracy theories.
Preeta, we just have about 45 seconds left here. Your title, Billionaire Nerd Savior King, which is the most appropriate as you finish your book in terms of which word really you would most closely identify with him? And as I said, only got about 40 seconds.
Today it would be King. He really kind of is on top of so many. I would say Savior King, perhaps. The billionaire is a fact. The nerd is a version of him back in the day. But today he's kind of on top of the world, sharing the stage with heads of state. And he is a savior of people in the global south with the Gates Foundation. So I would say Savior King.
Very cool stuff. Really enjoyed this, and good luck with the book, and really glad that we could get time with you. I knew Preeta Das. Preeta Das is South Asia correspondent for the New York Times, and her new book is Billionaire Nerd Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. That book is out today. Looking forward to that, and that's, no doubt about that, probably going to hit our weekend podcast and broadcast.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. Coming up next, we got Doug Krisner for Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. Just at 8 o'clock. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg in Washington, I'm Amy Morris. A rare bid to break up Alphabet's Google is one of the options being considered by the Justice Department after a landmark court ruling found the company monopolized the online search market. Sources tell Bloomberg that less severe options include forcing Google to share more data with competitors and measures to prevent it from gaining an unfair advantage in AI products. Starbucks has named Chipotle Chief Executive Brian Niccol as the coffee chain's new CEO and chairman after a year in the role by Laxman Narasimhan. Jody Lurie is a credit analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Their perceived sort of support of Israel, they've now had a lot of customers sort of not go because of that. Right. It's been tremendous. But then you now have China where they've really expanded a lot of their stores and they haven't necessarily gotten that growth.
Jody Lurie with Bloomberg Intelligence. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. Just download it wherever you get your podcasts. 4% in the regular session. Chipotle shares fell 7.5%. That's the most in more than a year. High interest rates and inflation have consumers holding off buying homes or pursuing renovations. Home Depot is feeling that pinch. The retailer lowered its forecast of a key sales metric for the year on expectations that consumers will continue to hold back spending. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta.
They basically said things are looking worse into the end of this year than they previously expected. Even their second quarter comp sales, so if you look on it from a quarterly basis, still seeing some pain, down 3.3%. The estimate there was 2.4% as well.
Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. And Paramount Global started laying off staff this morning. About 2,000 positions are going to be slashed before the end of the year. The Paramount television studios are shutting down this week. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, let's get to a story that has definitely risen to the top in terms of among our most read and certainly front and center when we think about companies and companies where their stocks are moving and can move the market. But this has to do with really the regulatory environment that we have seen increasingly being amped up when it comes to big tech.
Yeah, Bloomberg exclusive from the team, Leah Nyland and Anna Edgerton, writing that a rare bid to break up Alphabet's Google is one of the options being considered by the Justice Department after a landmark court ruling found that the company monopolized the online search market, this according to people with knowledge of the deliberations.
Yeah, the move would be Washington's first push to dismantle a company for illegal monopolization since an unsuccessful efforts to break up Microsoft. That was 2 decades ago. It's kind of interesting prescient considering the conversation we just had. Less severe options, though, include forcing Google to share more data with competitors and measures to prevent it from gaining an unfair advantage in AI products, said the people who asked not to be identified discussing private conversations. So essentially this goes beyond, right? When we talk about antitrust, we talked about this with actually David West and Matt and I did on Friday, but like it used to be are consumers being harmed, right? It was very simple, I think, in terms of antitrust, but you know, what's at stake here? And is it really a misuse of Alphabet or Google's power?
I'm just thinking about what happened to Microsoft after that landmark antitrust ruling decades ago.
Company fell apart.
It
No,
did?
I'm being, well.
No, what the company did was it missed mobile.
Yeah.
It missed mobile, and it allowed for startups, and it missed social media.
I was being a little facetious, though, because look at where Microsoft is today.
It's incredible when it comes to AI.
Exactly.
And when it comes to the innovations around sort of owning the workplace.
Yeah.
If you think about the productivity suite, and of course the cloud as well.
Right.
So yes, it hobbled the company for a few years, I think it's fair to say, but I think there would be those out there who argue that there would be no Facebook, there would be no Alphabet of all things, right?
Yeah. And here we are.
And here we are.
The government, it says, no matter, I guess, how this plays out, that they will likely seek a ban on the type of exclusive contracts that were at the center of its case against Google. If the Justice Department pushes ahead with a breakup plan, the most likely units for divestment are the Android operating system and Google's web browser Chrome, said the people who are familiar. Officials are also looking at trying to force a possible sale of AdWords. That's the platform the company uses to sell text advertising, according to those in the know. This is kind of interesting.
Yeah, shares fell as much as 2.5% in after-hours trading before erasing some of those losses after the team here at Bloomberg News reported on this story.
Yeah, so this is something that we will continue to follow. The U.S. plan will need to be accepted by Meta, who would direct the company to comply. Of course, breakup of Google would be the biggest of a U.S. company since AT&T was dismantled back in the 1980s. So, yeah.
As a remedy, the government might seek to stop the company from forcing websites to allow their content to be used for some of Google's AI products in order to appear in search results. There's a lot here.
Yeah, there's a lot here, and obviously this is something we're going to be following certainly into tomorrow's trade, especially as we see Google. I mean, it's only down about 1.25%, but I think there's a lot of options, a lot of different ways that this could ultimately play out. But again, as our headline on this Bloomberg exclusive says, a rare bid to break up Alphabet Google's is one of the options being considered by the Justice Department after that landmark court ruling that found the company monopolized the online search market, according to those in the know. So, you know, we don't talk about breakups a lot, certainly in this environment. It hasn't been the way, but certainly something that's under consideration on this Tuesday.
Check out this story and more on the Bloomberg terminal. We did see stocks move higher today. The NASDAQ higher by 2.4%, the S&P by 1.7%, the Dow by just over 1%. We got a big week of economic data continuing with tomorrow and Thursday as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is certainly something that is top of mind for investors in terms of the inflation narrative, you know, keeping that in check, which would then keep in check the expectations that the Federal Reserve will indeed start cutting rates come September. So we'll be all over that. The data points coming your way at 8:30 a.m. Wall Street time. So our team here at Bloomberg will be breaking it down. Do not go anywhere, though. Daybreak Asia coming your way over the next couple of hours. That'll do it for Tim and me. Have a good and safe evening. Balance of Power starts right now.